Good evening and welcome to Speakers Corner UK. And we are back with another review, this time of a recent stream, The Arena, from the 19th of February. And we're going to select two segments from this arena. There's obviously a lot in there. Some of it isn't of interest to us in particular. But these two were atheists that went on that had particular challenges for the Muslims. And we're going to review how this Muslim panel responded. Let's also bear in mind, of course, that the Muslim panel or these streams only allow one quote unquote challenger to come in against these five gladiators. Now, in any other sphere, one would look at this as a little bit unbalanced, but that doesn't seem to phase these guys at all. But both of these gentlemen, I think, ask good questions and put up a good show. So we're going to really look at, if there's anything that we could say that maybe they could do even better, is the way I like to phrase it. But certainly we're going to unpack the responses that the quote unquote Muslim gladiators gave and see what we make of that. And on that note, let me welcome, as always, my co-host, Stop Spamming. Good evening, sir.
Hi, good evening. Rob, you're looking at this all wrong. You have to feel sorry for them. It's only 5 of them.
Yes, well, that can also be the case. And I think, but both James and Yellow Pete in this case were sort of very polite and allowed them all sort of to ramble on here, there, and everywhere. Welcome if you're in the chat, if you're watching as well. We see Heisenberger joined. I think he was on the stream as well, so we won't necessarily be covering his bit. But if he wants to join us at any point on Gin and Tonic to discuss it further, then we'd be happy to do that. So again, this is where we hang out. I'll pop it in the comments. So if you are just starting out and watching, we also run the Gin and Tonic show, and that's the main server for Gin and Tonic. And there it is. So feel free to come and join that server, and you can always discuss with us further. But other than that, good evening and welcome to the guests, or if you're watching this as a recording, welcome to this as well. We hope it'll be perhaps a little entertaining, but certainly educational. Anything more from your side, Stops, before we get straight into it, sir?
No, that's it. Infotainment, sheer infotainment.
All right, so here we go. So
Hamza booted me off. Heisenberg, that's you naughty boy. What did you do to our poor Hamza?
Yeah, I think Heisenberg, if I remember, he said, I don't know, correct me if I'm wrong, he was Sikh or Hindu, one of those sort of things. So he already had some belief in a God, but then there was an interaction. So if you want to go and watch or look for it, just scroll through there. Maybe Heisenberg will tell us exactly where he was on the stream. I did see a bit of that. I didn't watch the whole stream, but I watched most of it. But the two here are normally the ones that we're interested in, the atheists discussing this. Although, if the Christian comes on and makes a valid claim against Islam, we'll have a look at that as well. What we don't tend to focus on is the Muslim-Christian counterclaims between, the Bible and the Quran. That's not so much of interest to us. It's rather if the claim is one way. We tend to focus on Islam. That's not to say that we think Christianity is any more true. It's more that our focus is just on Islam. So with that said, we're going to start here, and this is where Yellow Pete jumps in. So it's at about 46 minutes 15. So Yellow Pete's joins this group. He's been on before, so they do know him. Now, most people say that I've got a fair amount of patience and I'm fairly charitable. Yellow Pete is even better than me. So if I wanted to be more charitable, I'd be looking at somebody like Yellow Pete. Even I have my limits. So if you think that I have a reasonable amount of patience, or maybe Stops is slightly less patient than me, well, Yellow Pete is more patient than both of us put together. So you may well see that here. And it's certainly, because I do speak with him sometimes on Discord as well, and there as well, he has tremendous amount of patience and even more, he's even more charitable than I am. I thought, I'm reasonably charitable, but when I notice myself against somebody else, I can see my shortcomings, and I'm not beyond, recognizing that there's people that can do an even better job than I can. So let's see how he goes.
And
yeah.
Just as an explanation, I have not watched any of this. So if I say something that will be superseded by something that will come later, then I apologize. I didn't watch it.
No, Stops likes to do it clean or virgin, so to speak. He hasn't seen it before, so he's going to get comments in the moment. I have watched this before, so I haven't written down notes per se, but I've got the general idea of what was said. So without further ado,
Hamza, we got this Ijaz guy who loves doxing people. He's got a mental problem. Really, he's certified. Okay. Then we have who's this? Oh, is this Kevin? Oh, okay. So this is going to be a lot of rambling, a lot of noise, but nothing said. Is this Adnan Rashid?
Adnan, Rashid, and Hashim, yeah. But they
Oh
won't
my
all take part
God.
in this particular one anyway. So it'll
Look,
only
he's
be
really
between
scraped the
a
barrel
couple
on
of
this
them.
one.
Alrighty, let's get into it and see how it goes.
Yellowpete, a regular in the den. What's happening, mate?
Good evening. Can you hear me?
Can hear you.
That's great. Yeah. So for anyone that doesn't know me yet, I'm an atheist. And so like when I talk with Muslims about the existence of God, it fairly quickly we basically just don't see common ground on like the arguments for God and so on. But the other week I was thinking like if I actually accepted that these arguments were successful, right, and I even maybe accepted some of the other stuff that Muslims believe, like that there's revelation to human beings from the God, and that like maybe miracles happened in the past, then what kind of idea of God would that really lead me to? And I found that there's like basically a good number of ideas or conceptions of God that would be quite consistent with that. But the one that I came up with and that I guess I want to present here is it's basically like the God that in all the attributes of like his omnipotence and his omniscience and being the creator of the world, he's just the exact same as Allah. But the difference about him is that he doesn't have the attributes of being merciful and just and honest.
I just want to stop it here quickly. We've left the comments up for you guys to keep a side eye on. Obviously, you'll see the people interacting here, but keep your eyes here. He's hardly started yet, and this person already thinks that he's a troll. Now, I know Pete to some degree. We've spoken, and I probably know him for at least a year, or if not longer. He's the exact opposite of of what a troll could be, whether you agree with him or not. If you looked at him, he'd be the textbook example of what a troll is not. He's patient, he's charitable, he wants to discuss points, nuancedly and understand things and be honest and so forth. The complete opposite. So where this guy got this idea from, and if we had to ask somebody like that, okay, what is it that makes up a troll, number one, and how do you establish that yellowpete is such? Does anybody think that this wolf fellow would remotely be able to even if you just gave something coherent, that would be a start, right? I'd be sort of surprised and impressed. But to give anything substantial, I'd wager my house he wouldn't be able to say a single thing. So, but just keep an eye on those things anyway. Keep an eye on the chat, on the text chat here for interest. See the sort of caliber of people who are listening and indeed who are commenting on this discussion, and see whether they follow along and whether you notice any one of them saying anything that remotely could be substantial. And we might keep an eye to the best of our ability that we might respond to separately.
Has he just been allowed to speak a full minute?
Pretty much at this stage, because he hasn't fully given the view, but he's basically saying that, at this stage that, it's the same sort of God that they have, but, and so let's hear the but, because he's going to give a counter view that he wants them to negate.
But rather his interest is more like his own amusement and what he finds most amusing.
Yellowpete.
Yeah, go ahead.
What are you talking about?
Okay, once again, of course, and I was saying this recently, and I said something to Stops. It's rare that I sort of get frustrated, but I have a sort of a red line, and I think for me now, I'm at the point where with Hamza in particular, that line has been crossed. We've done so many reviews, etc., and I would say 9 times out of 10, and I'm probably being charitable, but hey, again, I can be accused of being too charitable. 9 times out of 10, when he opens his mouth, it's not helpful in any way whatsoever. Now, if he'd paid attention here, you would have heard that, hey, if I took on all of your beliefs and I had all of these other properties, but instead he was a trickster, or he was going to play a trick on us, or whatever the exact wording was that Pete used there, how could you establish, or essentially what I think he's going to say, if I remember, is how could you establish that is not the case? And so he interrupts before he's entirely finished, of course, because that's Hamza's thing, either because he doesn't understand, who hasn't got the patience, or both, very likely both. And so he's asking, what is he talking about? Now, if he'd given him another 30 seconds or whatever, or maybe even less, he would at least understand it. And the other thing that I find, what's the word? Sad, is that none of his Muslim interlocutors will jump in and say, okay, Hamza, here's what he's trying to say, right? Attempt to at least steelman Pete's position, although he hasn't quite finished it yet, but I think we can get the gist of it at this stage.
I think this guy once did it, and I forgot his name. The one guy that is quite reasonable, he once did this.
Yusuf Ponders.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's done that, right? But these guys have been around for a lot longer, and I think they're far less likely to do that. And for any of them, right? We have another 4 of his interlocutors there who could say to him, "Okay, Hamza, hang on a second. What I think he's saying is X, Y, and Z," right? That would be a way to. Pete, do you agree with that? I did this. I happened to be on Discord, I think last night or the night before, chatting to a Muslim, and at some point I said, it wasn't even a Muslim actually. It was I think it was a Christian, and at some point I stopped and I said, "Is that your position?" And I summarized accurately. He went, "Yeah, that's pretty much it." So if your interlocutor can say that to you, if you can summarize the position such that you understand it, and they go, "Yep, that's pretty much it," then you know that you've represented them accurately from their point of view, and then you can go ahead and either agree or critique it. But if they say no, that's not in the ballpark, then either you've misunderstood it or you're intentionally misrepresenting it. And that's not my intention, and I would hope that most people would not be doing that, and that would be a sign of somebody that doesn't want to engage, I would say, intellectually honestly.
And this is one thing that Hamza really sucks at. I mean, I've given an example in my last video where I said, where the guy says, "Okay, can you tell me where the liquid comes from?" And he says, "Okay, let me summarize this. You're asking, is the sperm the origin of something?" Like totally different, totally ridiculously different. And I thought, where does he get this from? Why doesn't he just shut up? Now, one more thing, the troll thing. My definition of troll is somebody who says a lot, does not contribute, and only derails everything. This is what I call a troll. And I don't see yellowpete doing any of that. But if anybody uses a different definition of a troll, well, then let me know if mine is off. Okay, That's it.
I'm talking about a concept of God.
Why?
Because, well, okay, I guess let's get to my point, right? So I think that, So I think that the conception of God that I came up with.
I mean, just look at them again laughing here. He made the point. The fact that you guys didn't understand it, I mean, okay, he could spell it out like he would to a child, but you're supposed to be adults. You're supposed to understand some of this sort of stuff. And okay, probably, Kevin, aka Asadullah Ali, there's probably a little bit more philosophically literate than the rest of these guys. But the 3 that are laughing there, I think that's doesn't reflect well on you guys. He made a specific point and he said this, right? And if you're following along, you can easily infer what the point is about this. If he has to explicitly state it, then either you weren't following or you didn't understand, in which case you might not be the guys that he would want to interact with. You very likely interact with somebody who got the point that doesn't have to have it spelled out in, like childlike language. But that's what he's going to do now anyway.
There's no good reason to think that it's any less likely to be real than Allah, right?
So you're telling me you've come up with a concept of God and you've rejected it?
Well, I'm telling you that there's no good distinction made on purely intellectual grounds between Allah being the true creator of the universe or this God being the true creator of the universe.
No, right. So I understand. So you believe you have a concept of a creator that could be God. Is that what you're saying?
Just as much as Allah could, yeah.
No, I'm not. Your question's in a vacuum. Look, I'll make it easy.
Okay, as soon as he says make it easy for you, he didn't understand the question and he's making it easy for himself. He's not making it easy for the interlocutor. I think it's clear to anybody who's watching this, because we're slowing it down, we're breaking this down, because in the heat of the moment, this can easily get lost. So we're breaking it down now. Pete's saying, hey, it would all be the same except that this is a trickster God. That's the only difference between Allah and the God that I'm proposing, right? So it's not like I'm making up, I'm presenting you with an alternative hypothesis. How do you establish that my hypothesis is incorrect, essentially? That's the short version of what Pete is doing.
Make it easy for you. We believe the attributes of Allah. Why? Because we believe Allah revealed those attributes to us.
Right.
Yeah? Okay. You believe in your attributes of your concept because of your own brain. What are you comparing here?
Well, basically because it's also consistent with
Is what you've got revelation?
Sorry, what?
Is what you've come up with based upon revelation or your own thoughts?
Well, for the sake of constructing this model, I have accepted that there is revelation from the God to human beings.
I'm not interested in your hypothetical scenarios. I'm saying to you is this.
Okay.
He doesn't understand it.
Yeah, of course he doesn't. And he's just not the right guy to do. One of the things that I think is useful here is think of him as just some sort of noise on the panel where you're not going to get very far. So I think at this stage, you want to try and engage with somebody else. You say, okay, you're not really understanding this. Okay, so is there somebody else on the panel that understands what I've said and would like to interact with me, please? He won't accept that. Of course, he'll make some other noise or whatever the case is. But if you attempt to ignore that to the best of your ability and try to respond to somebody else, then I think that'll be more productive. So it's almost a case of going on there and go, okay, I'm going to hear this noise from somebody that doesn't understand what I'm saying in any way. And every time he opens his mouth, he demonstrates that. So let me see if I can try and focus and see whether anybody else will. Now, Hamza's very loud and thinks a lot of himself. So the other panelists are less likely to jump in and go, hey, I'll take over. They'll sort of sit quietly until maybe if at any point he stops speaking. Sorry about that. I don't know what I pressed
with
there.
a capital P.
Oh, dear.
That's my favorite video.
Yeah, we'll come back to that one. Sorry
it's
about
also
that.
consistent with
Is what you've got revelation?
Sorry, what?
Is what you've come up with based upon revelation or your own thoughts?
Well, for the sake of constructing this model, I have accepted that there is revelation from the God to human beings.
I'm not interested in your hypothetical scenarios. I'm saying to you is this. Is your concept of God based upon your own intuition?
It's based on my own intuition. Yeah, just as much like if I read the Quran and then I said, oh, well, there must be this God Allah who revealed it, right? That's also my explanation, for example, for the existence of the Quran, right? And in the same vein, I'm saying here that my concept of God is the explanation for there being various religious.
You completely messed it up. I'm going to put it to the boys and then I'm going to rip it into it, yeah? So
Okay, you're going to put it to... Why don't you just keep quiet and let the Kuwait boys do it? Because you couldn't rip into it, if your life depended on it at this stage. You don't even understand it properly. So if you don't understand, you've got virtually no hope of, quote, ripping into it. But this is the sort of idea that this guy sort of labors under, that A, he understands it, and B, he's got some sort of knockdown response to it. And when he opens his mouth, it's immediately apparent to anybody who's paying attention that he has no clue what the actual argument is. If he did, he'd be more measured in this, and he'd represent Pete accurately, because you can see here that every time he's, quote unquote, tried to make it simple for you, he doesn't understand the argument.
So I'm going to put to the lads first, inshallah. So what you're saying is this. You truly...
Okay, that's a key word, by the way. Sorry to stop it again. What you're saying is, when you hear this from Hamza, that needs to be a red flag. 9 times out of 10, he is not going to be able to represent what you said accurately. So you go, okay, in your mind, I would be going, okay, I'm going to have to repeat what I said afterwards. Whatever he says, I'm just going to repeat myself afterwards again, because it's very likely that he cannot accurately represent it. Steel man would be a concept that he is just utterly unfamiliar with.
Truly believe that you can come up with an idea of God based upon your own feelings, thoughts, whims, desires, and then you can then Muslim who comes up with a concept of God based upon the Quran, you're saying your concept is equally valid, yeah?
Is that remotely what he said? What did I tell you? I didn't remember what Hamza was going to say. I didn't remember what he's going to say there, but I know that when he says, let me say what he said there, and he tries to represent you, you are almost guaranteed that he's going to get it utterly wrong. What did I say? And he just got it utterly wrong. But hopefully we'll get past this and we'll get to the other people, because I remember certain people respond. Actually, I don't remember who responded to him. Yeah, I know Asadullah Ali did, and he actually made quite an interesting concession. So let's see if we can get to that part.
It's equally fitting to the evidence, yes, and it's no less or no more complicated.
But who's saying it's more complicated? Who's saying these things? You're arguing against something no one said.
Well, yeah, I mean, you cut me off before I...
He's not arguing against what nobody said. He's putting forward his position, and he's just said to you, if you hadn't have cut him off, he would have said this. So it's not like he's arguing. He's adding the rest of his position that you never gave him time to do. So at this moment, he's not actually arguing. So you're not even aware of when he's arguing against you and when he hasn't finished bringing his claim, which is exactly what he's saying now.
Right. The idea, right? So now it's kind of ripped out of context a little bit, but yeah. Like you don't know what the specific idea is, right? So
no, what can you do? Build
so the idea
is, you're just going to create a hypothetical scenario and ask us to knock it down, yeah?
Well,
because we're seeking truth here, yeah?
Yeah, right.
Right. So
No. Let's be clear here. You already think you have the truth, and all you're coming here to do is propaganda and to try and bat away any critique that might come to you. This is not as if you don't already have the truth and you're on some journey seeking it. No, you think you've got it. Everybody else is wrong. And this panel and this propaganda idea of 5 against 1 here is to show the Muslims out here that you can defend against any claim because you guys already have the truth. So don't make as if you are seeking the truth or you care about it as in like you don't already have it. You've already got it, and that's all you care about.
Should I explain what the larger point is? You're going back and forth now. Like, should I just explain the idea, or should I explain why I think this is a relevant question?
I thought we said
That's good.
it's
Yeah, I
relevant.
can just
That's
repeat your
excellent.
question once again, just for the sake of.
May I? If it's okay,
Yeah, go
Yellow
on.
Pete?
Okay, we're over 5 minutes in here, and he's utterly clueless. And we've wasted 5 minutes where we could have got in. Now, Asadullah Ali, I think, who does actually understand the critique, is going to come here and respond. Thankfully, hopefully, Hamza will now just keep quiet, at least for a few minutes.
I
Sure.
believe that
Yeah.
he's attempting to ask, how can we demarcate between the two concepts with any sort of validity? So, for example, he comes up with any sort of conception of God in his mind versus our understanding of Allah, subhanahu wa ta'ala. And he's asking, how can we determine whether any of these are true? Because to him, it seems as though they're both valid, regardless
Oh,
of.
there you go. That's much
I mean,
better.
there's no actual evidence to determine which of these is actually the true version.
Look at again, the comment here. He's arguing with himself. And this is kind of sad, right? We say it and we don't want to generalize, but I think at least I would suggest anecdotally that many of the Muslims think or have similar sort of ideas here that he's arguing with himself. He's putting forward a concept. Asadullah Ali now has understood it and said, hey, he's putting forward a concept that he thinks is just as valid as ours. How do we as Muslims show that our concept is more valid than his? Right? Very straightforward. Took 30 seconds or less to summarize the position. And that's kind of what Pete's saying. Instead of wasting 5 minutes with Hamza, who doesn't understand anything of what's being said.
True
Yeah,
version.
but we also
That's
know
what
the
he's
Wayfarer, because I remember I sent him Packham from on Discord.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, we can always comment about the commenters themselves until the cows come home.
Yeah, but this is so typical. This is exactly. He's a kid, all right. He's a child. I don't know. I don't even know if he's 18, but he really has very little idea of what Islam is. He just has a big mouth. He has a chip on his shoulder, and he thinks anything that comes out of his mouth is something that everybody needs to pay attention to. But he's just an idiot. So sorry, I'm not allowed to say that. He is not all that consistent in the way that he presents his arguments. This is exactly, he's arguing with himself. This is something that he will say. It doesn't say anything. It's not a pertinent point, but this is the way that these people argue. This is the way that they bring their sort of testosterone out there, and they think that now they're making a huge point. They're not, because as
The
soon as
easy
you
thing
look
to
at
do-
this, there's nothing.
Yeah, the easy thing to do with a commenter like this, if you could actually speak to him, is say to him, what do you think Yellow Pete is saying? Right? That will tell you everything about whether the person understood it. And if they did, then they'd realize they wouldn't be saying this. So this tells us that he doesn't understand what's being said. And Asadullah Ali there just, in a short space of time, explained exactly what Pete was saying, and, which is fairly accurate.
what he's trying to argue. Is that correct, Yellow Pete?
But that wouldn't make sense.
Almost correct, except for
I'm
the
sorry.
last phrase, like where I
not
would
sure.
say that they're both
Right.
equally consistent with the evidence.
Okay.
But that would be saying that we're making the claim
Shut
of Allah,
up.
and just based upon what the Quran says, and we believe Allah exists because of that, which isn't the case.
Again, I just recommend at this stage you just say, okay, Asadullah, do you want to put forward something? Like, you just ignore what's being said there and you just go over to somebody else, right? If he's jumped in and he's understood it, you say, okay, so could you give me a response to that? Do you have anything you'd like to say on that? And just kind of ignore Hamza, because all that's happening here, it's wasting time, it's stretching out, and we're getting nowhere in particular. And if it were the case that he was the only interlocutor on and you came on and you went, okay, look, I'm going to have to dumb it down. I'm going to have to repeat myself like I would to a child. And you had that mindset coming in with somebody like Hamza, fine. But if you have other people on the panel who do understand this, then why would you waste the time here? Right? Because time is short here and you're not going to get anywhere. It's not like you suddenly got to go, now I totally understand it. Let me just make sure I understand it. And he steelmans the position. You go, that's it, Hamza, you've got it. What's the chances you think that will happen in our lifetime?
And
You-
again,
what-
just look at the comments in the chat. This is the level that this Hamza is appealing to. This is his audience. This is what he likes. This is the kind of entourage that he is generating. Really primitive, silly people who have no clue. Like Asadullah has gone a career end. No. And another guy said, pretty much, the Wayfarer. Yes, I agree with you. And then we have another Richard Darwin. Wow. I mean, the intellectual stimulation coming out of that chat is so exquisite. It's amazing. But this is what he is appealing to. That is exactly the kind of audience that he wants.
But what else do you believe in the existence
Well, my
of Allah
question
on
is,
other than
if you don't-
revelation?
If you don't mind, I would
No,
like to ask-
Revelation. Revelation's a different story. You don't have Revelation, we do. I don't know what you're trying to compare again. This is my This is what I don't get. I'm trying to.
Okay, but if you don't get something, why don't you just sit quietly and let other people engage? Maybe you'll learn something, because it doesn't matter what Yellow Pete says. You are unlikely to understand it anyway, because you have a barrier up against anybody who isn't a Muslim. This was the same thing that happened about 3 years ago when you didn't understand what a belief was. It took you 5 months and speaking to other Muslims before you finally came back to the park and said you kind of understood it. And even then you only had it half right. So it's very unlikely. Your mind is closed to anybody who isn't a Muslim, especially if there's critique against Islam. So the better thing I would suggest, I humbly invite you, is to stop talking, use your mouth half as much as your ears, and in this case, probably 10 times as much, or use it 10 times less, should I say, and just listen, and maybe you'll pick it up, or ask your fellow colleagues, because you're not going to accept anything that Yellow Pete says anyway, or indeed almost any other interlocutor, unless they tell you how wonderful Islam is. Then you'll nod along. But as soon as there's critique, you either don't understand it, or you don't want to give them time to put forward their ideas.
I'm trying to formulate what you're asking. So you always ask me crazy questions, I'll be honest with you, Yellow Pete.
I would like to...
Okay, so the fact that he says crazy questions again tells us everything we need to know here. He literally does not understand the critique, even though his fellow Muslim has explained it. Like if Yellow Pete had said that to a classroom and you brought Asadullah Ali in and you said, Asadullah, can you just explain this? And he explained it. I'm sure virtually every child of age 10 and upwards would nod and go, okay, I understand kind of what you're saying now, as long as they could understand English and those basic terms. He still doesn't understand, even when his Muslim brother has sort of said it out loud in a very short way that's pretty much accurate, apart from the last bit that Pete wanted to add in.
Hamza, I would like to listen to what Brother Asadullah has to say, because I think he's understood the premise.
Hello.
Okay.
Thank you.
Good morning.
One time when you have a Muslim who actually says in a polite way, why don't you keep quiet and let Asadullah Ali handle it? Thank you. That's a rare time where I will agree with Hashim.
First time. Yep.
It's always a first time.
Well, I mean, I'm just curious as to what exactly is your criteria for determining which of these is more coherent.
Right. I think
that's what I need to know prior to actually discussing this.
Yeah, I think there's two criteria that are reliable in saying that something's more likely to be true or be the case, right? The one is how well it fits with the evidence and how well it predicts the evidence that we see.
Okay.
And then the other one is sort of its inherent complexity, where some theory or some model that is very complex and needs to make a lot of assumptions and maybe carve out a lot of exceptions to its rules, that's inherently less likely to be the case than a more simpler model that still explains the evidence.
That's somewhat of a pragmatist solution. So I'm going to ask you two more questions, if you don't mind, prior to going into this further. What was the primary distinction between these two models that you had in mind, between Allah and your... I just want to make sure I have it right. And then the other one is, what is your understanding of evidence?
Okay, so the distinction, Allah is a God that wants to honestly reveal to human beings a guidance to life. And the conception that I have in mind is a God that isn't interested in truly guiding people, but he's just interested in sort of messing with them and giving them revelations here or there and watching them come up with all these religious superstitions and just basically being amused by it, right? So those are the two concepts.
So my primary concern with the distinction itself, prior to getting to evidence, would be what is really the point? Because as a pragmatist myself, I would ask, I would simply admit that there's no possible way of knowing, so I would have to just follow the most coherent path, regardless.
Okay, when I heard this, right, I was surprised. I didn't know that he was a pragmatist, right, a philosophical pragmatist. So his view is I can't tell the difference. There isn't, he himself said it, right? Other people could disagree. They might not be, they probably don't really understand it, the other guys, but that view, is, in a sense, it sidesteps it, because he's of the view, okay, we can't go, but I'm going to go with what best fits, whatever's pragmatic for me, whatever works best for me.
But that's a pragmatist. Just to be clear, a pragmatist is somebody who goes for the nearest, like an Occam's razor kind of approach, isn't it?
So pragmatism, I'm just reading it here off Wikipedia, so we've got it. Pragmatism is the philosophical tradition that very broadly understands knowing the world as inseparable from agency within it. So already it sort of has, in a sense, against, sort of begging the question against somebody who doesn't think there's agency in it. This general idea has attracted a remarkably rich and at times contrary range of interpretations, including that all philosophical concepts should be tested via scientific experimentation. That's interesting. That a claim is true if and only if it is useful. Relatedly, if a philosophical theory does not contribute directly to social progress, it is not worth much. So that's the interesting part, really, for me.
But then you can't be a Muslim and a pragmatist.
Well, he is. Well, he claims to be anyway. That a claim is true if and only if it is useful, Relatedly, if a philosophical theory does not contribute directly to social progress, then it's not worth much. So there's a couple of different things. The scientific investigation that experience consists of transacting rather than representing nature, that articulate language rests on a deep bed of shared human practices, etc. So it originated in the United States in 1870. So he's got a slightly different view. So for him, as he's going to say now, I think that it doesn't really matter to him. But okay, but that's fine. But then he's not somebody that you can have a discussion with because he has a different idea. But that in and of itself will have some of its own challenges. So you can sidestep and say, well, okay, I don't know, but I'm a pragmatist and I take this because I think it gives me great value in life. But of course, somebody else could take Pete's view and he could put it forward, hey, I understand this and this gives me value, i.e. that I think it's true and that's consoling for me or whatever the case may be. So he could give a different response. And a pragmatic response, and I don't know that Asadullah would have anything from a pragmatic point of view to counter him with. You'd have to say, okay, you have a different pragmatic response, right?
And this is why I would get totally sidetracked here, because I would now try and talk to Asadullah to understand what it is that he is saying there, because that for me is surprising.
Yeah, well, the first thing is that he can't tell, right, from his point of view. And that's fair enough if you're a pragmatist and you agree that there isn't any way to establish the difference, which was surprising. I didn't expect that, and I didn't know that he had this view. But it does allow him to sidestep it. Like I say, it comes with its own, every philosophical idea comes with its own baggage anyway. So there's none of them that you can say, is free from some sort of baggage or challenge or whatever the case is. And when you sidestep one thing, you'll have to take on something else. That's just, sadly, as far as I can tell, the way it works. So let's hear what he says now in terms of that. He has conceded that there isn't a way for him to know, or there isn't a way to know, at least by his lights, but it's not as important to him.
Regardless. I mean, for example, so say let's assume for a moment that Allah or God, this conception of God you have, is messing with us, right? How would we know that?
Well, we wouldn't be able to distinguish.
We wouldn't. So that's the thing. Yeah. So if we're not able to distinguish, if there's no realistic way to do so, however, if there is a God out there, and he's revealed something to us, we would have to follow the most coherent model present, right? So for example, so what I'm trying to say is basically it's sort of like questioning the issue here.
Correct. How would you know what the most coherent model is? Because Pete's model is just as coherent, and you've agreed to that. So when you say we have to follow the most coherent, how do you establish what that is? He actually asked the question to Pete, but that's actually the question that Pete would ask him, right? So he should really answer his own question. How would you establish it? And if he says there is no way to establish it, and he's going to take a pragmatic approach to it, well, okay, but somebody else could take the opposite. Pete could take the antithetical pragmatic approach, and Asadullah Ali, seemingly, as far as I could tell, wouldn't be able to mount any sort of response against it in any substantive way to say that Pete might be wrong.
Here is a dilemma that, like, saying, oh, are we really in the Matrix or is this the real world? Well, I don't really care, because I can't determine if that's true or not anyway. I just have to live my life as though it is real.
That's true, although in that case, it really doesn't make a difference.
I think we are conflating two questions there. One question is about the nature of God, and the other question is about the existence of God.
Okay, unfortunately, Adnan comes in here now and goes off on a tangent. And this is one way to notice, right? When somebody responds, in my head, I'm going, are they responding to what I've said? At no point, and Pete even conceded, if they were listening, Pete said, for the sake of this, I'm accepting that a God exists. Everything that you talk about exists, and it is the case, except that he's playing with us. That's the only difference that Pete put forward between the two different concepts. So at no point is Pete disputing whether the God exists. He's accepting that's the case, and it is really at least one attribute, if not sort of part of the nature of God that he's disputing, and asking the Muslims, could you demonstrate it? And Asadullah Ali has basically said, no, he doesn't feel there is a way to determine this, but he's going to live his life pragmatically. But that doesn't get you necessarily to truth. Or that's the question I would, if I was at yellowpete, I'd say, okay, if that's the view, would you agree then that you can't really establish what is true, but you're going on what is pragmatic to you? And you asked the very important question, which is, if we can't distinguish this, how do we know which one is more substantial? That's a question for you to answer and to make an argument in favor of. Why one more substantial than the other? But unfortunately, Adnan is now going to take us off on a tangent here, because he didn't really understand or wasn't following, even though his Muslim interlocutor above him actually spelled it out for him and explained it, right? He's now thinking that there's whether a God exists is in question. It's not in question in this scenario.
Okay, if God exists, the question about his nature becomes secondary. Okay, it's like having a bad boss. It's like having, let's say your conception of the boss is bad. Okay, you think the boss is bad, and some people think the boss is good. That's a question that can be debated, right?
That's exactly, in your sort of analogy, what Peter's saying. He says, how do we establish, in a sense, it's not the perfect analogy, but if how do you establish whether the boss is good or whether the boss is bad? If somebody comes along and says, I've got a great boss, and somebody else says, I have a bad boss, and everything else being equal, how do you establish that one is the case?
But the first question that needs to be determined is whether that boss exists. So I'm assuming that you already submit to that particular notion that the boss does exist, but you just don't like the boss, right? So are we discussing your conception of the boss, or are we discussing the very existence of the boss?
I mean, that just tells us, I don't want to repeat myself here. Yellowpete is outclassed. Right. That just tells us that he's just not following the conversation at all. At no point, again, at the risk of repeating myself, did Pete say, I'm disputing whether a God exists. He's accepting that one is. And so the fact that you have to ask that question immediately is a red flag for us that you are just not following the conversation.
This is what you need to determine.
Yeah, I actually think I've been pretty clear. I'm just discussing the nature, right? So for the sake of the argument, I'm totally granting that there is a God.
Okay, so we can simply come back and argue that that's the way God is, whether we like it or not. The fact that he exists and he's our creator, and this is the way he is. Even if you're
okay, go ahead. There's plenty to say on that anyway.
Come on, isn't he listening? I don't understand. I mean, Peter's. No, I'm sorry, I don't get it, really. I mean, Asadullah, even he understood it. And he asked the question, what has Adnan Rashid been doing for the last 15 minutes? And I don't get it. And then in the chat you have Adnan thumbs up.
I think, you know what I think? I'm going to speculate, is that their mind wanders, right? If you're not the person engaged and you aren't used to focusing for any amount of time, because remember in Speaker's Corner, it's all over the show. Yeah. It's higgledy-piggledy, so they're not used to focusing on something. If you don't focus, your mind wanders. It's called like internal thoughts that come up. And it can happen very easily, and your mind can go off. And I think that's what's happening here. And they've just, well, at least in this case, Adnan has just missed entirely the whole thing about Pete. And his response is, okay, well, if the God exists, he just is that way. But Pete can respond and say, but okay, he is the way I say is. How do you, Adnan, respond
none
to
is
that?
the wiser, exactly.
So all you're saying is you're stating like a trivial point for your side of the argument. Pete could say exactly the same thing, and you have a stalemate. And at that point, anybody who's watching would go, okay, I can't take your view on because you, the Muslims, haven't established that your God is in fact more likely. At this stage, you just said, okay, if he exists, then he is this way. And Pete can say, well, if he exists, he's my way. And that obviously is a stalemate, and that's not what you want. So you need to provide something that is persuasive to people who are paying attention, and that probably isn't much of your chat there, who go, okay, why would I be more likely to be persuaded that your version of the God exists rather than Yellowpete's?
And please note he's making an analogy. What happens when a Muslim makes an analogy? It fails.
Yeah, it's never a good sign almost never a good sign in our experience.
if your conception was accepted as correct. Let's say your conception, for the sake of argument, is correct, that God is basically having fun at our expense. Okay, that's the way it is. It's unfortunate, but that's the way it is. What's the problem with that?
But how do you establish it?
If that conception was true. So that doesn't prove that God does not exist. That's...
Oh, my word.
Oh, fuck. Can somebody slap him?
It's like... Okay, I think if you've been listening to us for the last 10 minutes, I don't want to repeat ourselves for a third time. I think at that moment when he said that you can't prove a God doesn't exist, I think that should really tell you everything you need to know about him being able to follow this argument. And it's not very difficult. And not only is it not difficult, like I say, his colleague above him there articulated in a short form what Pete was saying, and Pete added on a little bit at the end there. So anybody who's paying attention would understand exactly what the position is that Pete is putting forward.
That's still... the fact that we have accepted him as the most powerful being, albeit a cruel one, we still have to submit because we have no other option. Does that make sense?
Hang on a moment. What do you mean you have no other option? I thought you had free will. Are you saying you don't have free will? Or are you attempting to say, and saying it very poorly, that you have free will, but if that's the case, it's just the case? But again, that's a trivial statement. And if that is the case, then he wouldn't be worthy of worship. So if you had free will, surely, and the question that I would ask him is, if that's the case, Adnan, surely then you wouldn't worship a God that you knew was playing tricks on you, or that you had no reason to think wasn't playing tricks on you. Would you worship? Would you at least withhold your worship until you had better reasons to worship? Or are you just going to worship anything because you think it's true? Because if it's in fact some sort of benevolent God, or maybe it's Shaitan in disguise, are you prepared to worship Shaitan? And I had this conversation the other day, actually, interestingly enough, on Discord. And the guy said, yes, because I will still worship it because of the consequences of not doing so. He didn't use those words. I've just articulated better than he did. Hey, because there's a heaven and hell. Yeah, even if he was a bad thing, I'd still worship because I think that's what he wants and I don't want to go to hell.
Oh, boy. Okay.
That's devastatingly bad, right?
Yeah,
devastatingly bad. That just means that you'll worship anything that you think is superior to you. And
but
really,
you're going to worship Hitler. This
it,
is the problem.
Yeah.
Yeah, but we would have to accept that reality for sure. That's true.
Well, I mean, the
the fact.
Sorry, I apologize.
It's a shame though that Asadullah doesn't correct him and say, "Hey, Adnan, we're not talking about the existence of God. We're wanting to see whether there's any way to establish that our notion of God is more likely true
any
than
more reliable."
Pete's.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But look, excellent breakdown from Ustad Adnan. There you go.
Yeah. Again, like it's very sad. These guys wouldn't know the difference of a good argument and bad one and it has been spelled out not only by Pete, but by their own Muslim guys, and the guy that seemingly has more philosophical training than any of all four of the rest of them put together. And yet this particular fellow thinks that Adnan said something. See, that's where I think if I was critical of Asadullah at this moment in time, that's where I'd say to him, okay, Asadullah, please educate your other guys, because not only are they mistaken, but the people in the chat are also under the same delusion that he said something that was excellent, when in fact he's misrepresented it and hasn't followed the argument. That's where you should be educating your fellow Muslims, so we don't get tied down with these really bad things because Muslims aren't following or aren't paying attention to what the argument actually is. So much time, we saw it with Hamza, we're seeing it again now with Adnan. Right? If this conversation had just been with Asadullah Ali, at least we might have got to a point where he would have said, okay, I can't tell, that's what it is. And Pete would have to go, okay. And then he might have explored why that might not be impressive to anybody who wasn't already a believer. And he could have gone down some other route. But because these two guys don't understand it, a lot of the time is taken up here. And that's where I'd say to Asadullah, if he ever watches this sort of thing, help your Muslim brothers so they can see, or perhaps because they'll listen to you. They won't listen to me or yellowpete or anybody else. Even if we're correct, there'll be the ego against that, but they'll be more open, hopefully, to listen to you. So that's what I'd invite you to do, is to help them not misunderstand these things and waste time like this.
And if we give Adnan some constructive criticism, Adnan, all you have to do is just shut up, listen to what is being said, try to focus, try to understand what is being said, and then ask, am I understanding it correct that you are talking about that? And then listen to somebody who has explained it, who understands what is being talked about, to bring you up to speed, to bring you up to the same page that you can talk about the same things. Because you are looking at a different book in a different page in a different universe, and this doesn't help. So try and keep up with it, and if you don't know, just ask.
No, sorry, go ahead, Asad, please. Go ahead.
I was just going to say that, I mean, the other thing that I'm concerned about is where did you get this idea? Because if this God is messing with us, why wouldn't he send a message? I mean, like, let's assume that, yeah, he's messing with us, but where are you getting this idea from? Because there's nothing that's revealing that notion.
I think one thing that is particularly consistent with that is that, like, basically religious plurality, right? So we have all these people all over the world claiming all kinds of different revelations and coming up with all kinds of wacky beliefs and religions and practices. So I think that would be particularly consistent.
Don't you think that religious? Well, I mean,
point now.
it seems to me though that that doesn't seem to be a necessary connection between those things, because it sort of sidelines the fact that human beings are limited.
Okay, but the question that you asked him, Asadullah, is where did he come up with the notion? So he said to you the notion is because of religious pluralism, i.e. everybody, there's all these people coming up with different ideas, and this could well have been one of those ideas. And so if a person that actually had this idea came to you, how might you guys respond? So you did ask him how he came up with it. So you can't really say that that's wrong unless there was a contradiction or something like that, because you asked him his opinion of where he got this from. Unless you can say to him, well, no, in fact, it's not possible for you to get that idea from religious pluralism. I don't think you can say that it's wrong. You could say something else, but not that it's wrong, because you asked his opinion about where he got it from.
But I think yellowpete also, if you're listening to this, the next time just tell them, what is your methodology? Because I think that makes it more clear for them.
What do you mean by that?
But this is what is at the basis. This is what it's all about. Do you have a methodology? Do you have any way of differentiating between the one and the other? So what is the methodology that you can think of that would enable you to verify the one or the other? Because at the moment you're not able to do so. I can bring up 5 different scenarios and they are all equally valid, because you can all come to that conclusion looking at the text from the Quran and from generally Islamic texts. So what is your methodology that you have to be able to bring a little bit of certainty into the one model as opposed to the other?
Yeah, well, at least as I understand it, Asadullah said like there isn't a way for him to ascertain that, so he's going to take a pragmatic approach. But if one of the others had a view on this, then they could respond to that. Yeah.
And that they also have their own desires and their own wants and their own ability to corrupt things. I mean, so for example, even within science, which is, I mean, I'm sure you would consider to be far more accurate, correct, in its assessment of the world. I mean, there are various hypotheses and theories, well, not theories, but hypotheses regarding the natural world and even the way that we perceive reality in general, even in philosophy, and then even in ethics, metaethics, etc. But the sheer amount,
Rob, just
sheer plurality of these.
This is actually an analogy that works, okay? It's the first time that ever, because here we actually do have a methodology available to us to make sure that one model is valid or not. And this is the scientific method. This is exactly the way that it's supposed to work. And this is a very good analogy here, yeah.
Of these various opinions does not negate the fact that there is morality, or that there is a physical world, or that there is some sort of law and order. You know what I'm saying? So it seems to me that
okay, but he's not saying it negates that. What he is saying is that you don't have a way to establish that one hypothesis, to use your analogy, is better than another one. Yes, there is some ontological truth about the world that we haven't established, but your hypothesis is in no better shape than mine, and he could argue, although he hasn't, that his might be better because it explains it more simply or whatever the case may be. But he's not saying that morality or something else doesn't exist, or in your analogy, which is the equivalent of saying, well, God doesn't exist. He's really just saying that your hypothesis is in no better position than mine. Or if it is, how do you establish that? And if you can't, well, that seems problematic. And if you're going to take a pragmatist approach, well, okay, but that doesn't answer the question that I'm putting forward. And obviously, you can sidestep it, but is there anybody else here who could put forward some, as you put forward, Stops, some methodology by which we could potentially differentiate these two hypotheses?
I mean, there's more of a human issue than it is about God.
It's true. There are alternative explanations for why there is religious plurality. But I mean, in the same vein, I could also come up with alternative explanations for like the Quran, right?
Certainly. I mean, you could come up with alternatives.
Okay. It's sad that immediately when he's just said that, right? I didn't know Hamza was going to jump in, but as soon as he said I can come up with alternative hypothesis, in my brain, I'm like, okay, shit, he shouldn't have said that. And the only reason he shouldn't have said that, this isn't actually that he shouldn't have said it, but because Hamza is going to butt in now. It gives him an opportunity to butt in. Now, if he was speaking and it was just Asadullah Ali and Yellow Pete, we'd have potentially a bit more of a substantive conversation. But because he used those words, that's like a red flag to a bull, because Hamza doesn't understand what's going on here. And so he's now going to jump in here and override everything, probably.
Can I come up with something to challenge your idea that God is messing with us?
Go ahead, yeah.
Why is it everything taught in Islam protects us from all the things that harmed you? If God...
Okay, so the question is, why is it that everything that Islam teaches in the Quran protects you? And an easy response is because that's what a trickster God would have you believe, that he'll do some things that appear to protect you, or in fact do protect you, but other things either don't protect you or may not be the case. And how do you establish that is the case? So he's going to give you some truths, but some things that are not truths mixed in there, right, to play around with you. So Yellow Pete could agree that, hey, X, Y, and Z do, quote unquote, give you, or make things better or whatever the case is, but that doesn't negate the God. You'd have to show that there's nothing, and you'd have to, as you said, Stops, have a methodology show that it couldn't be the case that anything here is tricking us. That's a mountain to climb, and your sort of more intellectually read person has at least conceded that he doesn't see any way to do that.
If God wanted to mess with us, why would he not let us indulge in all these drugs, alcohol, gambling, and all of these things? Why would we prohibit the things that cause us harm?
He's explained. I've just given an explanation. Let's see what Pete says.
Well, it could be basically a selection effect of human beings, right? Obviously, it's not the case that all of the revelation must have come from a god, but much of the existing religions could equally well have been
So
constructed.
you've just changed the paradigm, mate. You just changed the paradigm. The paradigm is this.
He asked him, how could this be the case? He's responding, here's how it could be the case. And he's saying he's changed the paradigm. It's like he just doesn't know how to follow an argument, or in fact, a valid response. It may not be sound, but the response is not invalid. He asked him, how do you account for this? And he's given a response. Now, if you could disagree with the response, or if the response was incoherent and you could point out a contradiction, you could say, okay, that's an incoherent response. But I don't hear anything like that. And for him to suggest that he's changing it, he's giving you his idea based on the question you asked. How is that changing it? It's saying something that you either don't understand or don't like, and then your response is he's changing it.
If God is messing with us because you believe God exists, and you believe that all these religions are there to confuse us, yeah, then he sends the only religion he sent to the whole world, yeah, the only religion's text he preserved.
Oh, I mean,
yes, and the only one that gives you complete guidance in your life, every aspect of it, and by following that, you'll live a happy, beneficial life. Can you explain to me how that is God messing with you? That's the reality, not your hypothetical now.
I don't even think that Muslims would agree with that.
And Yellow Pete, I'm sorry, I just want to ask, going back to this one thing too. I mean, as a pragmatist myself, I just don't see the value in the challenge. Do you see what I'm saying? As a person who was like...
Okay, so there's two different things now. I mean, Pete could have answered Hamza's question, although it doesn't matter what Pete says, he's not going to understand it. But now Asadullah is asking a completely or suggesting or stating a completely different thing, which is he personally doesn't see any value in this. And you can concede that and say, okay, well, you personally don't see any value in it. That's fine. If you're a pragmatist, fine. Then you're not going to see any. But then you and I aren't really, because I'm not interested in a pragmatic approach. I'm interested in some other approach. And so we have two different approaches. So you aren't going to be able to say anything substantive for me then, in which case, I'm going to speak to somebody that wants to follow along the same approach as me.
Like, who has no other way to live his life.
Yeah,
I don't see the point. And I think brother Sheikh Adnan also brought this up earlier as well. It's like, well, you don't really have a choice in the matter. It's like, so what's the point of the question? And I'm not trying to undermine you, by the way. I'm just trying to ask sort of like, what benefit is this for me?
No, it is a good question, right? And I would say that on pragmatist grounds, you would definitely have reasons to prefer one belief over the other. My point is just that on purely intellectual grounds, you don't. Right? You can't, like, it's not that one theory fits the evidence better or is like much simpler or something like that. But yeah, one of the theories, like believing in it, might have more value for you.
Well, as a pragmatist, it's not simply about the benefit in that sense, but also which has the best explanatory power. So I mean,
okay, well, good. Okay, great. Now you said something substantial, right? How do you establish? And this was Stops' question earlier on. How do you establish that your one has more explanatory power? What do you mean by explanatory power, and how do you establish one has more than the other? What is that? What is that more? Is that something that you and I can agree on, some standard that you and I can both agree on? Now we can look at both of these under, with the same starting point, same foundation, and see whether in fact Yellow Pete's one can be dismissed. And if it can, then we can concede that it does, because we've agreed on the starting point that there is some benefit there, and we've agreed what that is and how it's more beneficial or more valuable, or indeed more truthful than the other one.
I mean, for example, earlier you said your criteria was evidence-based, and then you brought up sort of a pragmatist principles of coherence. And it doesn't seem like this really matches that your own criteria here, because to me, as a pragmatist, I mean, I've been a pragmatist philosopher for quite a number of years, and I can tell you right now, from this tradition of philosophy, we would find this sort of challenge that you're giving to be kind of pointless.
Okay, well, that's fine. Like we said, you're entitled to that view. And you could back it up from your point of view, but now we're talking from two different philosophical paradigms potentially,
exactly.
In which case you're not going to have anything substantive to say to me, and you're going to feel like this critique isn't of any substance to you. That's fine, but then obviously us having a further conversation seems to be is not going to get anywhere. So I'm appealing to those people who do think there is some methodology, and who do think that one view can, in fact, on intellectual grounds, which was the words that Pete used, can be shown that your view on intellectual grounds is more plausible or better supported by the evidence than mine, as in like Pete's version. So at this stage, I think Asadullah Ali has sort of put himself outside of the conversation with Yellow Pete at this stage, which is fine, but then they just need to acknowledge that they're in two different positions, and that there wouldn't be a meeting of the minds unless they could establish some criteria that he's just mentioned on this point alone now.
But I think what happened is you've now seen the weakness, because I don't hold Asadullah Ali, this Kevin guy. to a very high standard. I don't think so. What I think he's doing, he's now throwing around this pragmatist thing which he has learned as a kind of a safe space that he is hiding behind, that he thinks is saying to others, look, I'm not actually so bad. I'm not such a dogmatic person. And I don't think he fully understands what he's doing. And this is exactly what good point that you are making, that he's put himself outside of everything by going into his safe space, which I doubt actually that he fully understands.
Yeah,
the
I don't
consequences
know.
of that.
Yeah, I don't know enough about A, pragmatism, and B, his understanding of it for that. But if he's done it for years, then maybe he'll have some response. That would be an interesting question about that. But I think CJ summed it up, right? Why would the evidence favor the hypothesis that God is not trying to deceive rather than the other? That's the nice, short, concise version of exactly this.
He's always pointless to yellowpete. Comes with pointless points.
Okay, so we'll just ignore that. That's just at this stage, we'll just say that that's noise. I think if you're an honest person, even if you're a Muslim, you can see that the responses from Hamza is from somebody who is utterly clueless about this conversation, the nuance, and what the actual point is here. So I won't comment further unless it's so dire that we need to, and I'll try and focus on the other people. And I think, Hashim smiling, I'm not sure that he has any better grasp of this.
And the thing is, there's a question by Max Foster, which I think is quite interesting. What you guys say to the person that says these guys are harmless morons? No, it's not. The problem is that these morons are actually influencing others. There are a lot of very simple people around, okay, and this is what they are appealing to. And there's a lot of simple people who become Muslims because it appeals to them, because suddenly, you want to belong. This is part of the human nature. You want to belong, you want to be part of something. And here in Islam, as long as you say mashallah and inshallah a lot, you are one of them. So you are getting recognition no matter how ridiculously stupid you are. And this is why this is appealing. Like somebody like Hamza, if he goes into any other group, it doesn't matter which group, the people are going to look at him and say, listen, you're weird. But here, as a Muslim, he is he's getting hearts, he's getting, oh, he's so good, he's so brilliant, he's so everything, simply because he is putting on this silly show, just like hijab. He puts on his clown act and everybody loves him for it. So this is the danger that I see, that these harmless morons are influencing others and giving them the feedback that they need, that they want and that they need, that they are craving. And that is the recognition. They are getting the positive feedback that what they are thinking, what they are doing isn't so bad. It's actually an accepted thing. And this confirmation that they are getting is actually driving them further and deeper into this belief system, where it becomes very easy to abuse them. This is the problem, the consequence that I'm seeing.
Yeah, I'd sort of agree and just state it in a similar way in one sense, which is that I don't know that they are harmless, and I think that's the case. If these guys said it and they had no audience and they were saying this to themselves in their own house, I wouldn't be any wiser, and B, it wouldn't have any consequences. But as soon as it goes out to the other world and it starts to influence other people's ideas, and if there's a negative consequence to that, to these ideas being propagated, then it's no longer harmless. And if that were the case, then it would be a case of, that's why we're trying to do what we do here, to pinpoint these sort of things. If there's a good point, and every once in a while they might make one, we'll agree with that. But I think it's hopefully for people who are watching, because it goes by in so quickly. And if you're not used to slowing it down and breaking it down, especially if you're a Muslim, you're going to think that, as we see in the comments, that these guys have said some amazing stuff. But when we ask and we break it down, we in fact see that there isn't anything amazing that's actually been said that at any point so far has pushed back against Pete in a sense that would get him or any of us to go, okay, that's an interesting point. That's a response that we can now think about. That's something that is interesting and different. And we can work with that. We haven't had that at all yet. And so I think that's the main point here.
Well, the point here is this, yellowpete.
I'm not sure
What I just said to you, what part of that wasn't intellectual?
Well, I'm gonna have to remember what you just said.
Oh,
You said something about I think I can reproduce it actually. You said something like, why would the rules that the God gave us just give those who follow them such a great life, would protect them from all the harm and so on. Now, I think
I said, if God was messing with us, why would he give us perfect rules to follow?
Yeah.
Well, that's kind of what Pete said. So again, Hamza's immediate response is, no. You could represent it perfectly accurate, but if there's one word he doesn't like, even if 99% of it represent accurately. No. And I'm going to now say virtually exactly the same thing. I might change one word. It's just a knee-jerk response from him. No.
Just to
That's
say
what he's
something.
learned to do in Speaker's
Yeah.
Corner. Is just like those words. Everybody has tells, signs. We all do it. I do it. You do it. Stops. We all do it. His one is no. That's one of the things. Oh, hey, let me make it easy for you. There's another one. The other one is, okay, I'm going to say what you said, or let me summarize it. Or he doesn't use those words, but there's that key phrase as well. And these,
Are you
when you
saying-
get to know somebody like this, these key phrases, you know at this point that this is not going to be good after that. These key phrases are like, they're called, the way I've heard it, they're primers. They prime me to know that the next few sentences after those words are going to be something that is not going to help the conversation. It's now going to push the conversation back, and you have to go over old ground, or you have to repeat yourself, or do something that doesn't move the conversation forward.
This is a new one.
What part of that question was my intellectual?
Well, I think, first of all, I think even Muslims don't say that being a Muslim like guarantees that you're going to have a
I'm
better
not
life
asking you that
than a
question.
Muslim
Answer
life.
my question, please. I'm mentioning what other Muslims say. I'm asking you directly, because you said what I said wasn't intellectual. I want to know which part of it wasn't.
Okay, let me explain, as I understand it. The intellectual part is that you didn't give an intellectual argument for why your version of the God is more likely to be the case than Yellow Pete's. That's the intellectual. And in fact, Asadullah Ali seemed to accept that as well. All he can go is a pragmatist view. So the fact that you've said something isn't a response. What Pete means, and what you don't seem to understand, is an intellectual response that gives Pete or anybody else pause to go, okay, that's a response that could, in fact, make your version of the God more likely than the version that Pete has put forward. That's what he means by an intellectual response. Not that you've made some assertions, but that you put forward an intellectual argument for why your God is more likely than Pete's.
I don't remember saying that actually, but
Well, I think
yeah,
sorry, go ahead. Well, I was going to say, I think he's demarcating between rational and pragmatism. He's using intellectual as a synonym for rationalist position. And the thing is, I think that's where the confusion lies. And but I would say,
It'd be nice though if you did say, Asadullah, where the confusion is. It's not with Pete, right? So you say the confusion lies, but that would be, and the people who are watching might infer that there's confusion with Pete. No, there isn't. It's confusion with Hamza as usual. So it would help if you added that bit on. I know you won't, but that would have been helpful here. Unless you can demonstrate that Pete was in fact confused and you could give an argument for it, then you'd be fine. But when you say there's a confusion, it makes it sound like Pete's confused and not Hamza. And of course, I think it's blatantly clear that Hamza is the utterly confused one at this point.
And I have to point out the comments again. Yellow Pete is annoying, his voice is annoying, and his arguments are trash. Now, number one, his voice is totally irrelevant, and he hasn't made an argument. He's asking a question. So,
yeah, it is sad, isn't it? Asadullah just broke the guy's argument. Now, if you had to ask this fella again, this helps me at least know that I can have a conversation with somebody. If somebody were to make that statement, and this was on Discord, for example, and this guy typed this and he was in a voice chat or whatever, the first question I'm going to ask him is, what exactly did he say that you think broke, quote unquote, this guy, as in Yellow Pete's argument? What was it that he said, and why do you find it persuasive? If I just ask those two questions, and any of you who are watching do this to anybody who makes like a just a blanket statement like this, it will very quickly tell you whether they are following, whether they have any sort of response. Even a coherent one would be a good start, let alone a substantive one. But again, this is just about the meta, right? If he says his arguments are trash, okay, now he's making a claim of, like a quote rationalist claim about the arguments. What is it about his argument that's trash, and how do you respond to it? Just to say that, presumably, if you say that, you must have something in your head that tells you that, and you'd have a reason why. But that's the key thing when you hear it from people who are saying. But these sort of people will only say it in the comments, right? Because if you ask them on the spot, why do you think that's the case? They probably would battle to say anything coherent, which is sad. It's not what we want. It's not, and it's just to point out that people are just saying this, but they have no clue why. Presumably because he's non-Muslim. That will be the honest answer. If we dug down, it's because I don't like what he says, right? Not because I actually have anything substantive to say against it.
Fahid 22, Hamza, chill.
Yeah, so even some of the Muslims are sort of getting. We had the one earlier as well. I'm not watching all of the comments, but even some of the Muslims can see that Hamza's approach isn't fruitful if you want to have a discussion. If you just want to bulldoze over somebody because you've got the mute button and you can kick people out, and that makes you feel good, well that's fine. Then just say that, right? Then Pete and other people won't waste their time coming on here because they know they're just going to get railroaded and no sort of substantive conversation can take place. And I think at least some people here, like this guy potentially, might actually want to hear a different point of view and for you guys to respond in some substantive or at least potentially substantive way. And I haven't heard anything yet.
I would say that pragmatism is not simply about what necessarily benefits us, but also what provides the most coherent and beneficial explanation for things, right? So for me, like I said, from when you're giving these two alternative explanations, well, here's Allah and here's my version, how can we determine? Well, for me, that's a kind of it's a meaningless question. Or it's not really a beneficial question. It's not a beneficial challenge because it doesn't change anything for me.
Excuse me. Of course it does. It tells you which is what. It tells you that either there is a way of verifying, either there's a way that you can differentiate between the two, or it establishes that you cannot. That's the whole point.
Yeah, and following on from that, it would at least you'd find out which one is more likely to be true. But the problem is if you don't care about that, or if that's not a question that is as valuable to you as the pragmatic value you get from it, then of course you can sidestep that. But that, like I say, does have its own pitfalls. And then you'd have to be consistent with other things, right? In terms of that. So yeah, I would have said it if I were yellowpete a little earlier, if one could. Okay. And sort of said, okay, Asadullah, I understand your position, but then you and I, the further conversation isn't going to be fruitful in any way, because whatever I'm saying you don't feel has any benefit or any value by your lights, but then you're using a methodology to investigate that claim that I don't accept off the bat anyway. So we're talking about two different things. And if you had to demonstrate why I should accept your position, then we can talk. But if you're not going to put that argument forward, then I think at this point, leave it to people who want to put forward, by the words you used, was a rational argument. If you're not going to do that, well, let somebody else do that, because that's the view that Pete is taking, not the pragmatic one. So I think at this stage, again, it would be good to bow out at this stage.
I mean, it doesn't.
Oh no, I wouldn't expect it to, right? I wouldn't expect any Muslim to look at this and say.
Okay, so I'm just wondering what
like
there's more to this than what you're offering. And I apologize for interrupting. I just want to see if there's more here.
Yeah, the point to it is to realize that it's not on sort of purely rational grounds that you prefer one God over the other, right? There's a lot tied into that. Like
I think it's very holistic. I agree with you.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I think when you say holistic, Pete is not saying that. He's saying there's a lot of other things. It's not just your rational arguments.
Exactly.
You have other psychological, emotional, and pragmatic commitments that weigh on your view for this particular God, right? So it's not. So that's what he means by there's some other things, and you took that to mean holistic, as in like they all fit together so nice. Well, sure, you could say that, but then Pete could come up with exactly the same thing and say, hey, this all fits together. I feel much happier knowing that my version of God is likely true, and I get benefit from that. And he could put forward an idea based on the same criteria you do and say that this benefits me. And you would be seemingly helpless to respond to that. Hey, I'm not sure what he means by pragmatism is what I understood initially. Okay. Hey, Pete. So, yeah, welcome. If you want to join in and give us your view, I saw you were in Discord, but you were busy there. Otherwise, I would have pinged you. But if you want the link, I can drop you the link and you could always join in here. Cool. I don't know how much longer we've got to go with Pete. Actually, let me just see. Oh, it doesn't last much longer anyway, and then he gets kicked off. He actually gets kicked off, right? Because I was listening to this, and Pete and I spoke in Discord, and he got kicked off. I saw it, and then he sort of told me in Discord as well.
Because like purely on rational grounds, I don't see a way to prefer one over the other.
I mean, but purely rational grounds, we don't prefer anything over the other.
What? What? Well, okay, I think maybe, if I'm charitable, Sadullah got hung up on the word prefer. Maybe that's what it's almost like I prefer, maybe in his mind at that moment in time, the thought popped in, it's like vanilla and chocolate, that sort of thing, right? But if it's rational, if you care about what is true, then quote unquote, you'll prefer something that is likely to be true, and you would want to have reasons to push you in that direction. So I'm going to be charitable and say maybe he thought of it in that way, but I think that if he didn't, then I think if he meant like there's, what was the statement he actually said? Then let me just go back like a few seconds there. 103.50.
I don't see a way to prefer one over the other.
I mean, but purely rational grounds, we don't prefer anything over the other.
Okay.
Well, I mean-
no.
I think you would if you cared about like rational arguments and so forth. What
Yeah,
else are you going to
exactly.
bring
No,
to a rational
he
argument
totally
other than
misunderstood.
rationality? And there you're going to prefer the rational argument that gives you the better thing. So it depends, like I say, it turns on what the word prefer means in that case. And so maybe he just thought of prefer in a different view. But I think, if anything it was rational, then by definition you would prefer the thing that is more rational than the thing that is likely less rational. And what we mean by that is something that is likely more supported by evidence if there was. Okay, so Pete does want to join. So let me Pete, so let me give you the link if you want to pop in here. There isn't much time left, but we're going to go on to James's one. So if you want to join us and give us a few comments, we'll see how we get on, because it's going to be James's one, I think, is much longer than yours. But jump on in there for the last few minutes here. You give us a summary of your position, even if there isn't, you didn't get much to get in the beginning there. So hop on in and you can join us. Let's just get towards the end. At least you can give us a summary at the end.
So, what do you think? Well, I mean,
Sorry, I
that's
meant
what you
what
do,
I
I
said,
prefer. Yeah, too.
No.
Do you think that one idea is more like
Yellow Pete, I'm going to say it to you straight, and I don't know if Asadullah agrees with me or not. It is purely on rational grounds that I believe Allah is the rational belief.
Okay, so now the question is, great, you've made the rational position.
Super.
What's your evidence that one is more likely than mine?
Go.
Right, you've taken the rational approach. Great, you've said it loud and proud. Hey, welcome, Pete.
hey,
Can't hear you. There you go. Now we can hear you, sir. Good evening. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. Yeah, I just caught onto this 15 minutes ago, maybe. And
No worries, man. I saw you were busy in Discord, so I just popped it in a couple of the chats there. Let's carry on from here, because now Hamza's, and then at the end, definitely feel free to give us your thoughts at the end, because we're pretty much, you're going to get kicked out quite quickly, I think, from
Sure.
here. Let me just see here. Where are we? Again, just tell us when to stop if you want to. Yeah, so it's.
Yeah.
Oh, actually,
1:12.
it is a few more minutes, about 7 more minutes. So actually, there is time for you to give some thoughts. Okay, so Hamza at this point now has said he's gone with purely rational argument. I don't remember exactly what you would say here, or what you're going to say. Now he's put something on the table. My response, okay, what's the rational argument that your version of the God is more likely than a Yellow Pete's version? Let's see
That
what
would
he
be
says now.
interesting. Yeah.
Islam is a rational belief. It's not an intellectual. It's not a whimsical, emotional.
Okay, he's misunderstood this, right? He's misunderstood what Yellow Pete means by rational grounds is a rational argument. He thinks that it's entirely emotional. That's not the. Okay, so again, he's got the wrong end of the stick here. He's
yeah,
thinking.
I think he all this time. That's also, I think, why he was so upset in the middle of it. Like, he understood me to be saying something like, "Oh, you're stupid. You're just believing this for emotions, basically, right?" But yeah. The word intellectual I probably shouldn't have used to avoid this, or like some other language. But yeah,
I mean, to anybody else though, Pete, it's clearly understood, right? And Asadullah understood you. But you're right. I guess the thing, and because you've had some experience, and we have doing the reviews, and obviously I know Hamza as well. It's like if he's in the panel, you've got to choose certain words carefully, because they trigger words to him to anybody else that understand it more broadly, or understand it in the context in which you're putting it. But with him, you've got to tiptoe around, because otherwise you get these sort of fiery responses that takes you off on a tangent. He doesn't understand it, or he takes the worst possible interpretation you can. And that just derails the conversation, which is unfortunate.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that's Christianity. Islam is a hard religion, mashallah. Yeah, you work, alhamdulillah. Yeah, the idea that it's not rationally thought through, you're talking utter nonsense.
I'm just saying
So you present to me Krishna.
Okay, but the problem is now he's just going to rant, right? It doesn't matter what you say, and I think you tried to get in there and explain it, or at least you attempted to, but now he's on a rant, right? And once he's on a rant, he's not going to hear anything anyway. And to the followers, that's the part that's most interesting to me as well, apart from the arguments. They're going to hear him, and they're going to hear what they think is a lion just ranting, but not understanding your position. And that's the difficulty of you being, or anybody being, 5 against 1, especially if he's in control.
You present to me Krishna, Yellow Pete.
Well,
you present to me Krishna, and you present to me Allah, and you're telling me I'm going to choose Allah not based on rationale.
oh, you might in that case, but not with
In all
what I brought.
cases, you present to me Jesus, and
Okay,
you're
but
going to.
Okay, but Pete did in the very beginning give you the criteria. Now you are shifting the goalpost, and to use your terms, right? You said it earlier. I'm going to bring it back to you to look in the mirror. You are now bringing in extra criteria. At no point did Pete say, go and look at any other gods. He said, there's Allah, and there's this version of Allah, and the only difference is one is a trickster. Now you're talking about all these other gods. Talk about somebody who's bringing in extra criteria. At no point did he say that. straw man here. Goodness gracious.
And the thing, what I think is happening also, is that Hamza thinks that you, yellowpete, are arguing for the existence of God. You're not. You're just going for the different criteria. Your argument is far more sophisticated, and he cannot handle that. For him, he breaks it down. Somebody is somehow talking about my God not existing, and that's all he can understand.
He's definitely annoyed that I don't actually believe this, right? Like that I'm just like presenting something hypothetical. He wants to criticize somebody for what they actually believe. And I mean, to a degree, I understand it, right? But it's just not. Maybe then just let somebody else speak, right?
Exactly right.
The kind of
just let somebody else do it, right? People who understand it, maybe Sadat, Asadullah Ali, I don't know whether Hashim or Adnan seemed to demonstrate he didn't follow it either. But again, CJ has summed this up quite nicely, I think. You've got two hypotheses, tricks to God versus non-tricks to God. What's the rational justification to adopt one over the other? That's the essence of the argument, right?
Well, it's not an argument, it's a question.
Well, an argument slash...
it is. I did make the claim, right? I did make the claim that they are basically equiprobable, that you cannot meaningfully distinguish between them.
Yeah. Let's just stop that. Okay, here we go.
Rationally?
Oh, sorry, you wanted to say something?
Not me.
Or was that you on the... Now I don't know whether it's you talking here live or whether it's you trying to get a word in edgeways while he's ranting. So sorry. If I stop thinking it's you and it's not you, then that's fine. I'll just carry on.
Really?
What's your rational?
I want to clarify. I want to clarify prior to this that I didn't.
Okay, now we can see it's bulldozing, right? So now Pete won't get a word in edgeways, at least at this moment in time, right? 1, 2, 3 of them at least, or at least 2 of them, if not 3 of them, trying to talk over each other.
I don't say that we should reject.
I know you want to stop, but just don't interrupt, please. Let me just deal with this point.
I'm very sorry.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
What's your
Yeah, don't the guy that understands this better, don't interrupt while I, who don't understand this, go on a rant because I don't understand it. And based on my misunderstanding, I'm now going to chastise Pete. So don't get in my way while I do that, please.
rational ground to
By rational is to believe that Muhammad is on him?
I haven't finished the question yet. To not believe in the conception of God that I brought up in the trickster God.
Oh, okay. Because anyone can come up with an idea, the concept of God. Yeah. Yes. Oh, who cares?
Yes.
Okay. I believe in the reality and the truth of the reality of this.
Okay, so this is interesting, right, Pete? I did this the other day, and let me give you. When I say the other day, probably a couple of weeks ago, I was on a different panel and I actually took on the Muslim position. And I actually took on the mindset of the Muslim as well. It wasn't just, I did play devil's advocate, but I played it to a point where I played it for about 2 hours, right? Because it was on a different panel and they were all challenging the Muslims and they were saying some silly things. I mean, okay, I didn't go, right, let me just do it. I just sort of ended up becoming devil's advocate. And at that moment in time, it was instructive for me because when I did this, it dawned on me that he already believes it's the case, right? He knows it's the case. So anything else is just you making baseless assertions. It's not even up for debate with him. So everything else is just not the case. So he starts with the position, this is definitely the case, and everything else, I'm just going to find a way to bat it away. It's not like I'm going to take it on and evaluate it. I've done that already. I've got the conclusion that is basically irrefutable. And that's what I'm starting with. And anything else, all I need to do is find a way to show that it's less likely to be the case. But my position is not a neutral one. It's I'm starting with with the Allah of the Quran hypothesis. When I got this, it was like very instructive for me. Yeah, because we know it intellectually, but I got it on a more experiential level when I played devil's advocate for that long a time. I actually was like, okay, now I'm thinking exactly like that. I'm in that mindset. I'm like, following along. And it was instructive for me because I do forget that sometimes that at least somebody like Hamza starts like that. So to get through to somebody like this is very difficult because they're not prepared to step back and evaluate it neutrally.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, for them, you actually have to bring something that sort of destroys their idea, right? Like, because it's already true, you got to take it down first before you can come with any other ideas.
Yeah, exactly right. You bring anything else that's hypothetical, they're not interested. This is true. Why should I care about what you've got to say? Yeah, exactly.
This world, and I think that's the part you've missed here. We're not interested in hypothetical scenarios, we're interested in revealed information. How do we know about God and his mannerisms and his concepts and his attributes?
Well, I mean, he said it himself. We don't care about hypotheticals. So at this point, for me, and I said it earlier on, right? Having a discussion with him is just, it's not productive in any way. It's not productive for the audience. Not productive for you or anybody who's listening. And we're taking a lot of time up to talk about this. Whereas if you had maybe had more with Asadullah, or maybe even Sadat at the bottom left there.
I would have
you
actually
could have-
liked to respond to Sadat, but I didn't get the time in the end. But yeah, you'll
Yeah, exactly. But that's because he's got his finger on the trigger here, in the sense of the button and everything, and it's his stream. So he decides he's going to dominate it. And it would be okay if he was nuanced, he was charitable, and he understood the position. But none of that's the case. So a lot of time is taken up with his misunderstanding, his rantings, and just, again, trying to come across. I don't know whether he does it consciously or unconsciously. Maybe it's just built in now to come across looking like he's a lion to everybody else, even though he's not saying anything of value and doesn't understand your position. It's just, it's sad. It's a waste of time. And I look now, which panels is he not on? So that if I were to go on, at least I could have a discussion with somebody else, maybe, because otherwise you just go off in the long grass with this guy, and it's pointless.
And I'm going to make a prediction now that as soon as he ejects Yellow Pete, everybody in the chat is going to, yeah, the lion has struck again. Let's see if I'm right.
Probably.
Him revealing himself. Only through revelation you can know these things. And how do you know what revelation is?
You can deduce from the state of the world, presumably.
No, you can't.
Complete control over.
No, you can't, because man is in control of this world. Man is the one who is choosing and refusing. Yeah.
Well, but the features that you
whether God here or not.
Well, the features that you bring you to Allah are also.
Okay, there we go again, right? So this is the sort of thing. We just pay attention there to the comments, right? Hamza's on slaughter mode. And again, if you had to ask this fellow, what is it that Hamza said that's substantial, and why do you agree with him? You wouldn't get anything. And that's, for me, this is the sad part, right? I understand Hamza is dogmatic and he is who he is, very unlikely to change, very unlikely to understand anything. But people like this, sadly, are sort of taken in by it. It's almost like it's hypnotic, because he's saying things. He sounds angry. He sounds like he's in charge. He sounds like he knows what he's talking about. People like this are hypnotized. And that, for me, is really the sad part, right? This guy probably will never get to hear Pete articulate this with somebody, maybe like Asadullah or some other rationalist, who could have an intellectually interesting discussion that the Muslims go, okay, wow, I've never heard that before. Okay, I still believe what I believe, but that was interesting. I've never heard that before. And that's the sad part for me about these sort of streams, that you and James SC will bring something and it'll just get railroaded by, the simpleton, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm. Also part of this world, right? The Quran is part of this world.
Okay,
Muhammad is part of this world, right? So you're also deducing from features of the world that Allah exists.
Okay, I'll say it again to you. So you understand. I believe the Quran is revealed information about Allah from himself, not from Yellow Pete's mind. Yeah? So for me to believe the Quran is a rational choice than listening to your nonsense in reality. Yeah?
Pete, I wonder here, just a question for you at this point, given the way this guy's responded. Could you, or would you in future, if you were to make a similar argument again, would you sort of say, well, do you think you could say something like, hey, I'm deducing this. I read the same Quran as you, and as I'm coming to the conclusion that it could be a trickster God. The only thing I suppose that might throw a spanner in that is that then they're going to ask you to justify that. So were you on purpose not bringing in the Quran and just putting forward as a hypothetical? Or could you in future say, well, okay, somebody else could read the Quran and we might come to that conclusion?
Well, the reason that I was bringing up that I mentioned earlier was the religious plurality, right? So I would have expanded on that by saying, well, this is exactly what we should see if there is this trickster God, right? And he just inspires people all around the world to make up crazy religions. Well, that's exactly the world we have, right? And as opposed to a God that wants humanity to sort of unify under a single banner of belief, that at least that part of the world seems to fit much better with the trickster God. And you can obviously argue about it, right? And I didn't even think about it all that deeply before I called on, right? So when Hamza said, well, how do you explain that Islam's rules are like all perfect and so on, right? I didn't have like a ready-made answer at hand, although I could probably respond something good right now. But yeah, I don't know. It didn't get into that.
I think that's a good answer in the sense that you're not tied to the Quran, because if you do say something like and you aren't read in it, or you don't have some responses, or you don't know what they might say, if you were to appeal to the Quran, and then they're going to ask you for evidence, what in the Quran makes you think he's a trickster, right? Now you'd have to produce something. But with the religious pluralism, I do think it's a more general category, but it's an easier one for you to put forward and harder for them to critique, because that's not something that they're used to hearing. they're used to hearing critiques against Islam, and they've got their sort of scripted responses to that. Now, Stops and I might do that, but then we'd have certain verses in mind. If you don't have that, then I think actually that's kind of a good answer. Exactly what you said, and CJ sort of summarized as well. What would we expect if a God was trying to present himself as a single entity? We would expect people to have the same sort of belief, have the same ideas, and yet they have vastly different ones. So I think that is actually kind of a good generalist response if you don't want to go down the Quran route. So yeah, cool.
Yeah, that's that. Why do I believe the Quran's word of Allah? Because I believe Muhammad was a messenger of Allah. Why do I believe that? So long as he was a liar, crazy, or deceived, I believe he was telling the truth. That's it. That's rationale. That's logic. That's reason. That dismisses every religion of the world. Bring whatever religion to the table you have. What I believe dismisses it.
Can you see that? Right? It's dogmatic. He hasn't even investigated, 1/10 of all the religions in the world, but he thinks this is true because he thinks he has rational reasons. And then when you do go down the route of what it is, so for example, the Muhammad one, he's got his scripted response. Okay, he couldn't have been a liar, he couldn't have been mad, he must have been telling the truth. And again, right, he doesn't understand that even if we were to say that that Muhammad thought he was telling the truth, that doesn't mean that it in fact is true, right? This point hasn't reached him yet. Maybe at some point, if I ever get the chance, although I'm not sure I'd have the patience anymore for him in particular, but I would attempt to point out, although it probably would be against deaf ears, that even if I accepted Muhammad was true, that doesn't mean that what he said or saw or witnessed or whatever the case is in fact true. It just means that he's a truthful guy and he's truthfully relaying what he thinks he experienced. But I can grant you all of that. That still doesn't mean that it's true. Right? Yes, it's more likely to be true than somebody who's a liar, but that still doesn't mean it's true, and still doesn't rise to the level that I would accept as evidence for certain extraordinary claims anyway. But we can see the sort of dogmatic approach here now, right?
I can definitely
doesn't matter what you
at
bring
this
in,
point,
he's already got the truth. Yeah,
that the fuse is running out on him. Like
yes,
he's
yes,
not
yeah. You can see the emotion and so forth kicking in here. He thinks this is silly, mostly because he doesn't understand the critique, right? It's a hypothetical, and like you say, it's like selecting. And maybe you can do it next time if you go on or whatever the case is, and like say, hey, I'd love to speak to X or Y person, see whether that works, because otherwise it's just a free for all. I want to speak to Yusuf Pondus.
Yeah, that's a good idea. Like you'd probably have to pick up on something maybe that they said, so you have like something to start off the conversation with, or have a reason to talk to that person in particular.
Yeah, if you know them or whatever, right? So I know, for example, that Yusuf Pondus has done some looking into the moral argument for God, right? He's got some responses to the Euthyphro dilemma. So I'd go on and say, okay, and also because I've seen him, so he's actually represented arguments reasonably well, right? He said, okay, this is what I think you're saying, or whatever the case is, right? You don't really hear that from the others. And as soon as Hamza says it, you know he's going to misrepresent you. He did such a bad job in the very beginning with your trying to relay your question. It was just utterly absurd. But somebody like Yusuf Pondus, right? So maybe that's a way to try it in future. But then, like you say, you've got to know who's on the panel and which one you might be able to have a conversation with, but it's definitely not him. And then if that's allowed, right, then it gives you that opportunity to keep speaking to that person. So, okay, do you know what, Hamza, I did say I want to speak to him. So I'm just going to keep speaking to him. AKA, I'm just going to ignore you, but in a nice way, so that you can do that. Whether it will work or not, who knows, right?
Like that.
I think none of what you said is inconsistent with God basically having a giggle with Muhammad and just revealing it for the fun of it.
Yeah, but like Ustad Adnan said, that doesn't rule out the fact.
It's okay. It's this is just now it's kind of the amusing side to me. The fact that he puts his hands against the head, to him, he's like given you the truth. He doesn't realize he hasn't put forward an argument. He's made some assertions. In his mind, he thinks it's the truth. And the fact that you say it can be consistent with Muhammad having a giggle, just to him, can you see the like movements there? It's like to him, how can you be talking such nonsense? He doesn't realize he cannot articulate why anybody else would think it's nonsense. That's the problem. He just already goes from the position that you are talking nonsense. And that's why this is frustrating for him.
As I said earlier, if that is the case, if God is revealing all this for fun, okay, so what? That doesn't prove that God doesn't exist. That doesn't disprove God's our rationality about God. That doesn't disprove that. We can still be rational about God's existence. We can still be rational about Islam's truth. We can still be rational about that the Quran is the word of God. How does that notion, that idea that God is revealing all this for fun, disprove all that?
Okay, do you want to respond there? He just doesn't understand the argument. At no point did you, obviously say that God doesn't exist. But give some thoughts on what you heard there.
Well, yeah, it's just the same as before, right? He is trying to force it back to the question of whether God exists or not, which is just completely past anything I'm trying to say. I think I'm just reiterating here that I'm talking about the nature of God, not his existence.
Yeah, exactly. But the question of why is this important is because if you are a rationalist and not a pragmatist like Asadullah, then presumably you want to have good reasons for believing that your version of the God or your conception is more likely than the version that Pete put forward. So that's the big reason why this should concern you. If you're a rationalist and you care about a rational argument or an intellectual argument, then you should be stopped in your tracks at the moment. Go, okay, how could I rationalize this to myself, or to my followers, or indeed to anybody else who might ask the question? That's, to me, why this is an important question that you, Adnan, should think about. Not the fact that we're talking about whether a God exists or whether you might have to follow him or there's going to be some punishment, but because you think that there's a rational argument and here's a position that's challenging that with what seems to be an equally plausible hypothesis, that's why you should be concerned. And that's, I think, the response I would give. It's easy to do it afterwards, of course. But that's the kind of response I would be giving to him, answering the question why, because in his mind, he doesn't see why he needs to understand this. Now, Asadullah excused himself because he went along the pragmatist route. And so he feels like it's not a concern for him. But the other guys, especially Hamza and likely the other three guys, also think that they want to have good reasons for this. And they probably don't know what the pragmatist route is, and they probably wouldn't go that route in any case. So there is a reason for them to care why this is important.
Well, with Asadullah and his pragmatism, the interesting part was that, I mean, pragmatism typically means something like you're going to look at the consequences, right, for holding the belief. Is it conducive to like a good life or something to believe this, rather than is it really true? At least that's how I understand pragmatism. But then he also brought in like kind of circled back to notions of is this a better explanation or is it more likely to be true, right? So, and those I think are juxtaposed, and I don't know exactly what he means by pragmatism.
Yeah, so I read a short, but I'll give you a little bit here of the Stanford Encyclopedia, just a bit that's kind of more interesting. The general idea has attracted a remarkably rich and at times contrary range of interpretations, including that all philosophical concepts should be tested via scientific experimentation, that the claim is true if and only if it is useful. Relatedly, if a philosophical theory does not contribute directly to social progress, then it is not worth much. Mm-hmm. Okay, so that's kind of part of it, but they also have this other bit. So there's a couple of things thrown in there, like you say, that seem to be, at least on first glance, a little bit in conflict with each other. So a pragmatist might take one or the other of those. I'm not sure if they could take both. Maybe they could. I'm not philosophically, deep into that. But I think it's more you and I and most people are thinking that it's the idea that that the claim is true if it's useful, and that if it doesn't contribute directly to some sort of progress, then it's not worth much. That's kind of what I initially thought as well. But there are a couple of extra things that you can throw in there. And on that view, that's fine. But then he does open himself up to you responding with the same sort of critique back and saying, well, hey, I think that, the trickster God, is more pragmatic because, hey, I've now recognized that it's a trickster. And that makes me feel good that I've overcome the test of deciding whether it's a trickster. I can live a satisfied life or whatever. And hopefully, God will reward me or whatever. So you could come up with some sort of story that gives you pragmatic value as well. I'm not sure that he would have anything to say against that. But he did say, as you pointed out, that he wanted one that had greater explanatory power. And how does he establish that?
Honestly, I'm perfectly fine not saying that there's no pragmatic value whatsoever in believing in the trickster God, right? The whole point is just to make them realize that the belief is based on not on intellectual grounds.
Subjective, yeah, exactly.
As soon as they just accept it, I'm perfectly fine with them holding it on pragmatic grounds, right? Then we can talk about it.
Exactly. Okay, cool. So that was your view. So you wouldn't even need to go down that route. I understand. Okay, yeah. And Asadullah seemed to accept that, right? But then because he was took a pragmatic view. But the other guys, obviously, Adnan didn't understand it, and neither did Hamza, in the sense that he thought he was giving a rational argument. But the other guys would be more committed to trying to, at least attempt to provide some sort of argument, but none of them did, unfortunately.
I don't know what the point is. Seriously, we don't know what the point is. Even if that's true, let's say for argument's sake it's true that God is doing this for fun, for his own sake. Okay. Firstly, it's very difficult to determine that. It's a claim. It's a claim, and you have to substantiate that claim. But let's assume that claim is true. Let's assume for a second, for the sake of the argument. So what? But that's the way it is. Did you choose your hair color? Did you choose your height? Did you choose your ethnicity? Did you choose your environment? No, you were born into it, right? Okay, just like that, you were born with a God who created you. That's the reality. Right?
Okay, I think I've answered this, so we won't repeat ourselves here as to why it's important. I've given a reason here for why he should value this, and I think that's
look,
what
Imran
he's
is there.
asking. Yeah.
Face it. You can't change it.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, it's just, if it was true, obviously there would be vastly different consequences for us, right? It wouldn't actually, in the ultimate sense, like improve our eternal well-being to follow this or that religion. Right?
Yellowpete, may I add a thought to what you just said earlier on? When you said that maybe God's just playing around, he's messing around and giving a false revelation, and the thing is this: look, like when this is not how we operate in our everyday life, right? When we meet somebody for the first time, we don't assume the very worst about them. If you think about it, by default, we assume good about other people. If you
Okay, so it also depends where you are and the context in which you are, right? If you were living in a country that was war-torn and you came across somebody you didn't know, I'm not sure that you're going to walk up to them and say, hey, how are you? Do you want to come to my house, right? It depends on the context, the time, et cetera, right? So maybe he's thinking about in some peaceful societies, but in war-torn societies, you're going to be very cautious of the person you're going to come up to. You are going to, for your own survival, you're going to be very skeptical of people that you don't know, especially if it's not your tribe or you don't recognize them or whatever the case is. So I'm not sure that this is maybe anecdotal, or he's maybe thinking of certain places, but that wouldn't certainly be a general rule that I'd be happy to accept off the bat, and it would depend on the time frame and so forth. So there's a lot of extra things that go into it, but there's something else wrong with us, but I'll get to that later on.
Yeah, just maybe play the full response first. Yeah.
Sure.
Think about this
about other human beings.
So if I can just finish the example. So what I mean is I'm meeting you virtually right now for the first time. I'm talking to you for the first time. I don't just assume that you're probably a child abuser. You probably cheat on your taxes. You probably by default are a rapist or murderer or this or that. No, by default, I'm going to assume, right, that you're a decent, tax-paying, law-abiding citizen and a good neighbor to people. So the point here is that even though I don't owe you anything, because you haven't done anything for me, I haven't done anything for you, right? So you don't owe me anything, but hopefully we start on a footing whereby we assume by default, we assume good about each other. So the point here is that the creator, the one who did give us everything, the one that created the universe, that the one who's creating oxygen for us, the one who gave you your heart for free, your kidney for free, your liver for free. You don't have to plug your liver into a USB port in the morning. You don't have to plug your...
okay, we'll come back to this.
Is totally wrong.
It's not giving it for free. There's a tremendous price to pay, so it isn't for free. Come back to that.
Exactly. He's expecting worship. He's expecting a whole lot of things from you. And by the way, thinking clearly, your comment, now rape your slaves part, doesn't appear on YouTube, by the way. It's being censored.
In the morning to charge it. If that being exists, should we not then by default assume good about our creator rather than assuming that, well, maybe he's messing around, maybe the Quran is a joke, maybe he doesn't really mean it? It would make more sense. Once we've proven that God exists, it makes more sense to, by default, assume a good opinion of our Lord rather than a bad opinion of our Lord.
Okay, go for it, Pete. You give a response and then Stops and I will. Go for it.
So my response would there be that the reason that we assume the best of other human beings is that we empirically know something about human nature, being that if you do go into interactions with other human beings with like good faith and just assuming the best, most of the time that'll end up benefiting you and them, right? Most of the time that'll lead to cooperation and whatnot, right? But we don't have any a priori reasons to assume that God's nature is anything like human nature, and so we don't have any grounds to say, oh yes, assuming goodwill or like going into just assuming the best is going to have similar effects as when we do it with human beings.
Yeah, I think you can say that certainly in the modern world, in certain places. I think, as I say, it might not be the case if you walked into a prison. I think, and it was a prison for rapists, then you would look at every prisoner as being a rapist. So it depends on where you are. But if he's talking about a modern Western society, then yes, there is. But the other thing is that, again, when you use that analogy isn't necessarily analogous with God, because as you pointed out, and has often been the case throughout history, we don't just assume that God is good, but this is the mindset, of course, that the people, that believers are in. They are inculcated from a young age that God is good. So for them, it's almost incomprehensible that they could think otherwise. But if they stepped out of it and they looked at it from our point of view, which I know is understandably difficult for a lot of them, They go, okay, how could I establish this? At best, I'm agnostic at the moment about it. I can't take a position either way. That would be the best thing you could say. But you could also bring up, the evidential argument from evil or any other thing along those lines and say, what I notice about the world, as best I understand things, is that in fact there's a lot of suffering, there's a lot of evil, etc. And based on that criteria, it's more likely that it's an evil God, and therefore actually it would be more likely to be the case based on the evidence I see of the world that isn't the fault of human beings, because they don't have the same view as the Christians do with original sin. So for them, it's all a test. But what's the test for, the baby that dies, or, the child that's born, in pain or whatever the case is and can never walk or blind or whatever? They'll just say it's a greater test. You can try and get away with that with humans. But once it gets to animals, that's where none of these arguments work, in my view. Then you're dead in the water. And I think that's where, to me, is more likely that if the Abrahamic God exists, then he is like you say, Pete, either a trickster or malevolent. That's more likely. So I'm definitely not taking the view that it's more likely a good view. And the analogy with human beings, as usual, I don't think correlates with the God, because we have some prior background knowledge about human beings in certain circumstances, as you've quite rightly pointed out. We don't have that with a God. Or whatever background information we have, I would argue actually favors a trickster or a malevolent God looking at the world itself.
Exactly, because the analogy again is flawed, because if I have no information about a human being, then I have no information. But with a God, I do have information. I do have this thing that I am being created so that I can jump up on one foot and pat myself on the head. And if I do that, then I'm being a good boy. Then I stand an increased chance of going somewhere, which is absolutely wonderful. So this is the kind of information that I have about this. So it's more likely that this is a trickster than anything else.
Yeah, now we can put forward arguments, as I say, for that. And I think that's something Pete doesn't get a chance to, and he might not have gone down that route anyway. But we could present reasons why we think it's more likely that it's a trickster. Or we could just take a neutral position and go, okay, I'm undecided. You, sir, Mr. Sadat, give me reasons. Don't just tell me that and use an analogy, because I could, give you a different analogy of wartime or whatever, and then that analogy might not hold as much as you think. So that wasn't a good response that might persuade anybody who's listening to this why we should accept, a benevolent God, more likely of being benevolent. He hasn't said anything that we can take on that's substantive there, at least to me.
Yeah, and if I take the people that I met for the first time, the people who were rushing into the hotel to shoot everybody, I met them for the first time. So it's not a beneficial situation, is it?
Yeah, like I said, it depends on the context. But again, Pete might be referring to sort of modern day in peaceful societies. There, you might not immediately think that somebody's a rapist or whatever the case is, but it is context dependent there. So it depends on the time frame that you're doing it.
So that the point he's making is that the revelation may be true, God does exist, and he wants us to worship him.
Okay, now he's got the point. I mean, why didn't he get this in the very beginning? Of course, because he was saying in the beginning that we got to talk about whether God exists. So at least hopefully the penny's dropped now that that's not being the case.
Yeah, but hang on.
He hasn't quite gotten it, right? He thinks that my concept of God wants us to worship him.
Oh, okay. All right. Maybe I've got in too quick here again. Let's see.
He may well be a noble God. He may well be a morally upright God, but he's doing it for the sake of his fun.
But that's a contradiction then. Yeah, that's a contradiction. If he's a moral and ethical God, but he's messing around.
Oh, now we get into a whole
doesn't work. Yeah.
That would be now going down the route of how do you establish what is good. By a trickster's God's view, whatever he's doing is good. If he's the standard, then whatever he says is in fact good, unless you have some external standard you want to appeal to. But it's not a contradiction for Pete to say, okay, unless, Pete, you want to say otherwise, if it's a trickster God, then by definition, what he's doing the tricks for a particular reason, and he can just label that good. If he's the standard, then whatever he labels as good is in fact good, if you take that horn of the Euthyphro dilemma. If you don't, that's a whole different view.
Yeah, if you're holding to divine command theory, then you'd have to concede to that. But I think I get to clarify the point here in a second.
Okay, cool.
Messing around with us, that's a contradiction.
Exactly.
Yeah, well,
exactly.
and that's why I'm not saying that, right? I'm not saying that he's has our best interest at heart or anything like that. He's just interested for his own fun. And what you said, what you said just now.
I'm done with you. Asadullah, have you got anything to say to Yellowpete on his way out?
I just wanted to clarify that when we talk about something that is not rational, it doesn't necessitate that it's just emotions. So, for example, non-rational view would be like an intuitive, something that is sort of attached to the intuition. So the fitra is something I consider a sort of a non-rational position. And then after that, the rationality comes in because the fitra is what sort of is under the is under rationality, is what boosts rationality, is what makes rationality a valid thing, something that is real. So I would say that to yellowpete, for me personally, I understand where you're coming from. I see this challenge that you've made. At the same time, though, in concordance with everyone else in this panel, I don't see how that really changes anything or why it's even a challenge, because there's no way to really get around it. Like, say,
okay, but that's in conflict with what your fellow panelists like Hamza think, right? They do think there is a way to get around this through some sort of rational argument that he can't or probably never could articulate, but in his mind he thinks there is a rational argument. So that definitely doesn't agree with at least Hamza and probably most Muslims. They do think there are rational arguments that can be persuasive. So I'm not sure what you're actually in accordance with here. I mean, Pete, you're even more charitable than me. What do you think he means when he says he's in accordance with his fellow Muslims here?
Yeah, I didn't agree with this, but I felt like I wouldn't be able to challenge this point anymore. So
yeah.
I think I just left it standing.
Yeah. Okay.
It is happening, but how do we determine that? And with the revelations that we have on hand, the revelation we have on hand, the Quran being the most valid, the truest one, right? There's nothing else. We have nothing else to go to. So I mean, even if that were true, we couldn't determine that. We wouldn't be able to verify it. And so we have to work with what we have as human beings with limited knowledge, right? So for me, it's like it's like a non-challenge because I can't do anything about it. It's like, what am I supposed to do?
Well, if you took a rationalist approach, then you'd want to find rational reasons for it. But if you take a pragmatic approach, you can sidestep that, I guess. But again, that's your view and not the other Muslims' view necessarily. So we'd have to speak to other people. At this point, like I said to you earlier, Pete, you might not have been on. When he first said this, I would have gone, okay, that's interesting, that's cool. But then to me, it seems like you're talking past each other in the sense that you have a view that you're putting forward and you're asking for a rational response. He's going, well, I don't have a rational response to that. I have a pragmatic response. At that point, there's nothing further to say to him in this view. You could challenge his pragmatic view by maybe doing a reductio against him. But other than that, it's like, because this is a repeat. He's probably said this about at least 3 times to my count, maybe more, but at least 3 that I remember. And so, but it's not going to change your view. And in fact, if I were, I'm listening to you, I'm going to put this forward to other Muslims. Say, how do you establish the difference? To me, he hasn't said anything that would in any way give me pause. He's just said, well, I don't accept that because I have a different criteria for assessing whatever this may be. And that's fine. We could talk about your criteria, but that criteria I don't accept. And so your response to me is just as insubstantive as you think the critique is to you. So it's like a stalemate at this point with him. But then he should really excuse himself and not further comment because there's nothing that he's going to say and there's nothing you can say to him. So it's like a stalemate just on this point alone, it seems to me, at least with him.
Yeah, but then it points out the impotence. It points out that he is not able to come up with a conclusive argument that will show the one or the other is to be preferred. There's nothing there.
Okay, but that's true, Stops. But then he's just going to argue, well, I don't do that as a pragmatist, right? You rationalists have to do that. Okay. I have to do that, right? So you can, but again, every worldview and every philosophical position comes with its own baggage. And, one could challenge him on that separately, but then you'd have to sort of really have a decent understanding, I think, of how the philosophical pragmatic view works, because what we are saying as lay people, I guess, is at least part of it. At least what I read there was a little part of that suggests that he might actually go, no, I don't accept that. I'm going to take some other bit of that, right? So that's why philosophy sometimes becomes kind of a dead end, because people can select certain parts of philosophy and say, okay, I accept this. Whichever part they take, in my view, there's normally a critique against it. I've never heard of a philosophical view that is beyond critique. So it doesn't matter what it is. We just have to learn what the critique is. But it isn't. I don't think it's going to be substantive from our point of view to challenge him on that, because it's at least as far as I can tell, more of a fringe view that I've come across at least, and certainly other Muslims are not going to be convinced by this or even understand it. So that's not going to be helpful for the conversation, depending on what your criteria is.
But I think the point is that the challenge itself stands. It's not been answered. You cannot
from a rationalist
distinguish.
Point of view.
And it's a good challenge, and that's it. There's no answer.
Yeah, and I think, Pete, you're on that server, and I'll join you again. I don't know if you've done it since you've had this conversation, but it'll be interesting, and I'll ask you if you haven't, or if you do it again. And I'm going to do it now. I'm going to ask them, right? How do they distinguish between the two? I might take a couple of different points, but I'll put forward the same idea, and I want to see what other Muslims have to say about this.
Yeah.
What is it that they can say from a rationalist point of view that would be a defeater to your position, that you couldn't respond with? I'm not sure at this stage.
Yeah, that'll be interesting.
Yeah. Okay. I think we're almost done here, basically.
Yeah.
It's really all I have to deal with. It's all I have to work with, right?
Yeah, I think when faced with like alternative explanations that are, just as valid as the explanation that you're currently holding, I think like what you typically do with that is you sort of reduce your confidence that you have the right solution.
Have you just after everything you just heard, you just said that your opinion is just as valid as ours? Did you just say that? You still pulled up?
I don't remember saying that.
All right.
Look,
Anyways, well,
Okay, I think we won't be able to do James SC as well, because this has taken
Here's James in the chat.
1 hour 50. So I'll rename this video, and we can do the James SC critique again, because that's even longer than Pete's one, and it gets a little bit more feisty and even more heated than this one, as far as I can remember.
James, when are you around the next time?
Who? James SC. Hey, James. So we're going to do another one. I'll ping you if you like. I did ping James. He said he was busy. He's not sure when he could join. Had I known, next time I'll just ping yellowpete, say, hey, do you want to join us, if he's involved or whatever the case is.
Sure.
But I think at this point, but you see the ending. I'll say a last piece and then I'll give it to Stops and
I'm done.
Close us out. But on this point, right, his question to yellowpete was, after all you've heard, are you still saying, right? And Pete said, well, I didn't think I said that. But we could slightly change his question. Pete, after all the things you've heard, are you still suggesting that intellectually your position is as equally valid as mine? And if you'd said yes to that, which I think you would, and I would too, in his mind, the question I'd have response is, what do you think was said out of, quote unquote, all of this that should make me change my mind? We've got one guy who's a pragmatist who can't actually really deal with this, and he's acknowledged that. The rest of you haven't said anything. You've misunderstood it. Why would I in any way even be remotely interested or pushed to change my mind here? He just thinks that because these other guys have talked a lot, that somehow they said something substantial. He just doesn't understand anything. But this is his new, you might know this, Peter, if you don't. Yeah. This is his new approach, right? If at the end, all the other guys have rambled on and said various bits and pieces, to him, he doesn't really understand it, but they must have said something valid. And if you don't accept it, well, then you're out of here. And that's my piece.
Not only that, he's kind of painting you. Well, he's done this at least with some others. I don't know if it was like justified or not, but he's painted some of the callers as like, they're just too dishonest, and if they come back on, they gotta accept like XYZ position first, or else they can't come on and things like that. Yeah. So I don't know if that was like the same attempt here or not, but yeah. What's interesting about the whole episode, I was actually contacted by a bunch of Muslims afterwards on Discord, right? And they were, the majority feedback that I got was that they apologized for Hamza's behavior. So I guess there's some hope there.
Great. Well, thank you for coming on and telling us that, right? And we saw a few of them in the chat there, but I think that's really good to hear, because I do think that they're, and we're not seeing enough of that, and that will hopefully change our mind as well, because we're getting anecdotal evidence from, the chat and the ones they put up, and hopefully that gives us pause that in fact there's more that we don't know about, that aren't airing their views here, that in fact disagree with at least Hamza's approach, right? You can disagree on intellectual grounds, that's one thing, but with the approach, the physical approach, or I say physical, but the approach that he's taking to how these conversations take place on his channel, or SE Dawa, or not SE Dawa, EF Dawa, I think people are not happy with that. And I think what really needs to happen is those Muslims need to air their views, because the more they do that, probably nothing will give him pause for thought, but at least it will be out there on the record, and then it'll be good for us to know. And we go, okay, but there are other Muslims, like you said, Pete, that actually don't appreciate this, that want to hear these views and not have the person cut off or overridden or steamrolled or whatever the case is by somebody who really doesn't understand what's going on. Stops, do you want to finish us off?
Yeah, actually I do, because it shows that there are questions out there, there are topics that you can go into that don't immediately make you into a hater and an Islamophobe, because you're asking a question which sort of acknowledges the existence of their kind of attitude towards a god while at the same time questioning it. So they can't immediately nail you down on you don't know Arabic, you just spewing hate and things like that. So there are topics like that around, and this is something that I have just learned, that there are things that you can talk about which are like give you a good value, that are a good basis for a discussion that you can talk about, not with Hamzas and those people, but with other people. And this, I think, is a valuable lesson for me. That's what I'm taking away from this.
Yeah, I think it's how you come across and the critique that you level. Pete's one was more a generalistic one, but I think a good one. I think where it's how we deal with it with the Quran, because that's where the rubber really hits the road. All of this sort of stuff, they'll walk away going, oh, that's hypothetical, whatever. But once you get down to the Quran, then that becomes a lot more real for them. And there might be a bit more hostility there, but I guess the best we can do is do it in sort of, follow Pete's example to the best of our ability. I'm reasonably charitable, but even Pete is superior to me. So I look at Pete and go, okay, I could always be even more charitable and even more patient than I am already. But I think that's where we might see more pushback. But all we can do is do it in the best way. We can, to whatever degree, tiptoe a little bit. But I think ultimately, we're still going to bring the critiques. So, but hopefully this has been useful for you as viewers. That you've got something out of this. As always, we learned something. It's great to have Pete on. Thank you so much for coming on. It's a shame it was at the end, but at least you got to say a few things.
No, much appreciated.
We will come back with James SC. I know he's in the chat there. James, hi to you. We'll try to come back this week. It's more a case of when I can do another one of these, because Stops is hopefully available here and there. But we need to coordinate, and then we'll pop it in. So just make sure you subscribe to the channel. You'll get a notification. Join the Discord server. I'll just put that up here again. Because then we always post in the Discord server, and if you are there, you'll get that notification as well in Discord. So it's two places, because unfortunately we can't always schedule it like days out or whatever the case is. Stops and I have got to manage family and other commitments, and then we only get to decide maybe an hour or two before the time. So keep an eye out for that. But thank you again to Pete. Thank you to Stops. Thank you if you're a viewer. We will be back with the James SC hopefully this week, if not early next week. So keep an eye out for that.
No, this week.
And we'll need at least 2.5 hours, probably, if not longer, for that one. If James is available, we'll have him on. If James is there, it'll be 3 hours, but that's actually perfect. We love to have the person that's on come in, give their thoughts, how they were feeling at the time. Maybe they would have said something different, because sometimes they don't get a chance to explain themselves, and we can get the thought process, and that's good for us as well, because I'll learn something as well. So on that note, gentlemen, thank you so much. Thank you to the viewers, and we'll be back again
Thanks, guys.
at some point with another review.
See you soon.